Hey everyone, this is the Grayzone Live. I'm Ben Norton, joined by my colleagues Aaron Maté and Max Blumenthal. You know, on YouTube and on Twitch, actually on Twitch right now we're having an issue, and you can, by the way, if you're a Twitch fan, you can watch the stream over at twitch.tv/the Grayzone News. The title is so long on Twitch that it's apparently not working right, so I'm going to figure that out. But the title is long because there's a lot of topics that we want to discuss today. We are now entering the third month of the Biden administration, and we've seen that on foreign policy, there have been very few differences between the Biden administration and Trump. In fact, you could argue that the Biden administration is more hawkish than the Trump administration. And I've seen people joking that the only real difference between Mike Pompeo and Antony Blinken is as a diet. So it's been pretty incredible to see just how hawkish the Biden administration has been. So I'm wondering, we can just start there. And there's a lot of issues we want to talk about today, but what do you guys think about the current situation?
Well, first of all, welcome to our manel. And we're gonna man up with Ajit later on. Ajit Singh, great contributor to the Grayzone. But yeah, Ben, and if you came here by way of Twitter via our Twitter card, then you saw. I hope you picked me out of our criminal lineup. Ben is actually being tried as an adult, so just wanted to get that out of the way. And yeah, there's so much to talk about that we were actually debating before we got started a little bit late, where to even start. I think we're going to do China when Ajit comes on, because he's really been just shattering a lot of the imperial narratives that are just coming out with increasing volume. But today there was actually a lot of discussion on social media of an issue that had been kind of buried and forgotten. And it was interesting, actually, in the last, I'd say 2 or 3, even or throughout the Trump administration, for the first time, an issue where I got attacked. I think the first time I was ever attacked as like Putin's puppet was on the issue of Ukrainian neo-Nazism. Ukraine is really the base of international neo-Nazism at this point. I mean, you actually have a militia incorporated into the National Guard that is semi-officially neo-Nazi, the Azov Battalion. You have the founder of 2 neo-Nazi parties, Andrei Poruby, who is the speaker of the Ukrainian Rada, the parliament. And you have the interior minister basically as the patron of the National Corps, this neo-Nazi fascistic group connected to the Azov Battalion, which is actually active in Kiev. It's sort of their political wing. Anyway, I mean, when you would talk about it back in 2014 during the Maidan coup, which was one of the signal events in the history, that I think this is one of the defining events in 21st century European history. If you talked about it, you would be called Putin's puppet. But, and I was actually attacked by some Polish neoliberal in the New York Times for daring to talk about this back in the day. But then throughout the Trump era, there was actually some discussion. You would even see some characters at Bellingcat criticizing these fascistic forces. An Amnesty International report came out in Ukrainian about how destructive they are to Ukraine's social fabric. But we didn't really hear much about what was happening in Ukraine. And we didn't hear any protest when the Biden administration came in, and the author of the Maidan coup, Victoria Nuland, the wife of Robert Kagan, this extreme neoconservative who had been the president of the arms industry and State Department funded Center for New American Security, this militaristic think tank in Washington, came back into the State Department. And I felt like as soon as I heard the name Nuland, there was going to be heat on the eastern Ukrainian frontier. And today we see a massing of Russian troops in response to shelling by Ukraine of the civilian regions of Donbass. We've seen the Ukrainian president, Vladimir Zelensky, who is kind of came in as a kind of a peace president and has been going nuts for 3 weeks. We've seen him basically call for an invasion of Crimea, which would, bring us to the brink of world war. An invasion of Crimea against the wishes of its Russian-speaking population. And now brinksmanship has reached new levels. And this is part of just the general kind of atmosphere of tension that we've seen with the Biden administration. I mean, before we get into details with Ukraine, let's talk about Biden calling for the denuclearization of North Korea, which means no diplomacy is possible there. That's a red line for the North Koreans. A related issue, Biden administration threatening to sanction Germany and German companies over the Nord Stream pipeline with Russia, which would deprive Ukraine of billions of dollars, but which is a really important deal for Merkel's government. And there's some rumors and murmuring in Germany that the Biden crew is actually backing the Green Party to undermine Merkel. You've even seen the Biden administration threaten India with sanctions over buying Russian missiles. Then the attack on Syria, which was one of Biden's first foreign policy moves as president, calling Putin a killer, calling Xi an autocrat without a democratic bone in his body, and then going to try to have a climate summit with these figures who he attacked. I mean, it's this escalatory rhetoric, and Aaron, what set the stage for this, and particularly Ukraine, was the domestic hysteria of Russiagate. I really feel like in so many senses here, Biden is catering to a domestic constituency that was cultivated by the corporate media for the past 4 years.
Yeah, you saw that. I think you pointed this out when he did the interview with George Stephanopoulos. It was like George Stephanopoulos, the reporter, who was trying to encourage Biden to call Putin a killer and to announce some new kind of bellicose policy towards Russia. He was like, how are they going to pay for it? How are they going to pay for this? Talking about that bullshit report that came out recently about a supposed influence operation targeting the 2020 election, even though the report could come up with zero examples of it, nor explain how it came to this conclusion that Russia ordered yet another election interference operation. I wonder about what they're actually thinking in Ukraine. Are they trying to start another war there? Or is this the kind of thing where with like Georgia in 2008, where I think Saakashvili, the Georgian president, either he misunderstood Bush and John McCain and people like that, or he was encouraged to basically launch an incursion into
South Ossetia.
South Ossetia. And then so Russia responded and then he got creamed. Like, is that do you think actually that the US will be prepared to send in troops here? I mean, I just don't see it.
I mean, the Ukrainian readout of the call with Blinken or Blinken's people was really disturbing because they actually gave the impression that the US was ready to go to war, but the State Department has been much more. They said that, we have we offer our unequivocal support to Zelensky. And we saw in the past weeks, as Zelensky's been shutting down opposition media, which the U.S. would condemn in any country that it targets for regime change as authoritarian, dictatorial, even totalitarian. I mean, he's just been shutting down Russian language media left and right, especially outlets owned by Viktor Medvedchuk, who is considered a pro-Russian oligarch, but who speaks for a large part of Ukraine's population. The U.S. supported that. They vocally, aggressively supported the shutting down of these opposition stations. And so we see clearly the U.S. is actually pushing Ukraine into this kind of neoliberal, NATO-oriented regime, the same way that it's actually protecting Jovenel Moïse in Haiti, allowing him to basically wipe out the Supreme Court, eliminate the parliament, run a one-man rule for the next 2 years, this unpopular figure. So, I mean, we can clearly see the Biden administration, as it came into power, saying diplomacy is back. Biden was saying America is back, and we're going to stand up for democracy and the rules-based international order, actually advancing a unilateral order where it is actually pushing specific governments towards autocracy, Ukraine being a perfect example. And this was totally inevitable. I mean, I brought up Victoria Nuland But we can also talk about Michael Carpenter, who is this completely unhinged character. Back in 2018, I went up to the US Capitol because this figure I mentioned before, Andre Parubi, who literally founded two neo-Nazi parties, the wonderfully named Social National Party, which is certainly not they're sort of antisocial, and Patriot of Ukraine, which was like their street movement that beat up migrants. He founded them. He's spoken favorably of Hitler as a populist leader. He's close to all the neo-Nazi factions we talked about. He was welcomed into the US Capitol. It was a big display. All the Hill staff came out. It was really shocking to me, along with Georgian lawmakers and all these, figures from the Baltic states where the US is running these like NATO puppet regimes. And Parubi was being shepherded around. I noticed that the person who was walking him around the Capitol and taking him to and from meetings was Michael Carpenter, who at the time he was the executive director of the Biden Institute at the University of Pennsylvania. He was Biden's Russia handler and Ukraine handler when Biden was basically the imperial lord of Ukraine after Maidan. And Carpenter, I went up to him and I said, do you know that Parubi founded these neo-Nazi parties, that he is basically denying the role that Ukrainian Nazi collaborators played in all of these anti-Jewish pogroms? Like, what are you doing? And he's like, he is a great figure. He's someone who's standing up for his country. He got really upset with me. And then over the next 2 years, he was attacking me on Twitter saying, that me, Tulsi Gabbard, Noam Chomsky, and Glenn Greenwald are like Russian agents. And he was just always attacking me. This is the figure who is in the Biden administration now guiding this policy. And he is just as tied to the Ukrainian ultranationalists as he ever was. So again, the Biden administration on foreign policy, and all of this is going below the radar, is as extreme as my worst predictions could have been over the last 4 years as Russiagate peaked. And we haven't even gotten into China yet, where we see just a straight up continuum between Trump's, the hybrid war Trump started with China and the Biden administration.
I think Ben is lining up that clip of Max talking to Mike Carpenter. But one thing I wanted to say about Russiagate, your comment about how it set the stage for this. I mean, you have the component of using Russiagate to criminalize any kind of diplomacy with Russia. That was a major aim. Anytime Trump talked about getting along with Russia, that was presented as evidence that he somehow compromised. And then you have many specific Ukraine ties, including the fact that, a key cast member in the fictional narrative of a Trump-Russia plot is this guy, Konstantin Kilimnik, who was a business pal of Paul Manafort. And near the end of the Mueller investigation, when they realized they had absolutely nothing, like this thing was over, all of a sudden they introduced this claim about Kilimnik that he has some vague Russian intelligence ties. And that became this big, huge bombshell thing. And they developed this conspiracy theory that Kilimnik was given sensitive polling data, which he then gave to Russia. And Russia somehow used that polling data to tailor their social media ads about like Buff Bernie and masturbation ads to battleground swing states. That was like the big part of the meta narrative. Now, Mueller never defined what those so-called ties were, and the evidence that he gave for Kilimnik being somehow associated to Russia was ridiculous. And later on, the Senate Intelligence Committee this past summer took it a step further and called him a straight-up Russian spy. And of course, no one had any evidence for it, but the reason they did all this is because he was convenient for a narrative. And they also wanted to particularly stigmatize his efforts around Ukraine, where during the campaign and a bit after Trump won, Kilimnik was involved in some like offhand discussions, not even serious, but like some discussions about a peace agreement for Ukraine, which ultimately resembled very much the Minsk Accords that were reached between all the different parties. And one of the key elements was having autonomy for the Donbass, some form of limited autonomy for this region that is resisting the Ukrainian government right now. And so calling Kilimnik a Russian spy and, mixing him up in this collusion conspiracy theory was also a way to stigmatize that. So whoever is doing this all behind the scenes, they have a very clear agenda. It's to continue, as Max was saying, the Maidan coup that they started back in 2014 and stigmatize any kind of remote attempts at resolving it through diplomacy.
Yeah, well, I have that clip here. This is Michael Carpenter of the Biden Institute.
This is basically Zelensky's boss. I don't have any sound here.
No sound, yeah.
Which has been a problem.
This sound's not working?
No.
No sound.
All right, well, just
basically a guy who works for Biden got really mad at me, just to sum it up. No.
And then
I mean, I was really polite to him. I was like, sir, did you know that he's founded 2 neo-Nazi parties? One of them is called the Social National Party. Like, he has a book where he appears in a literal brown shirt with a tie and a gun strapped to his waist, and he has like a shaved head, and he's standing in front of a Bandera monument. This is like his memoir, and this is the guy that Biden's Russia handler is welcoming to Capitol Hill. But like, we're the ones in like it's a brown blue alliance. So yeah, I wish that the sound would play. I bet there's a lot of other insane clips we could play. I mean, but the point is the really dangerous figures who enacted this coup in 2014 that completely shifted Europe towards this kind of permanent war footing that brought back the atmosphere of the Cold War. These reckless characters who then went out of government through the revolving door to arms industry funded think tanks funded by Raytheon, which, is benefiting from the Ukraine conflict, because every time we hear a call for offensive weaponry, it's for the Javelin missiles that they're making that are going straight to the Ukrainian military. And now I wish, I don't know, actually, if you go to my Twitter account, Ben, I retweeted someone who tweeted out a clip of Ukrainian soldiers being rushed to the front, and one of them was wearing a Totenkopf patch. That is,
I already have that up. I tweeted about it too. I didn't even see. I mean, I saw it going around a lot. And what's incredible is, I mean, this is a Nazi SS symbol, and here I'll zoom in. You can see the skull there. I mean, this is a Nazi symbol. But what's incredible is that this isn't the first time we've seen this appear among Ukrainian soldiers, this Nazi symbol. Back in 2018, the former Ukrainian president, Petro Poroshenko, posed with a bunch of these soldiers. And as you can see, that one of them next to him is wearing that same Nazi patch, as was pointed out by this amazing website, Defending History, which does a lot of really good original research on these issues of Holocaust revisionism in Eastern Europe, in these NATO member states and European Union member states. And this research never gets any mainstream coverage.
Yeah. I mean, as this conflict intensifies, it will be increasingly hard to discuss the real base of neo-Nazism, where neo-Nazism is finding sponsorship once again by a traditional sponsor in NATO, because of the domestic constituency in the U.S. that was created by Russiagate, where it appeared. At first I thought, when George Stephanopoulos cornered Biden, or that he cornered Biden, put Biden on the spot, and that Biden was unable to finesse his way out of the trap that was laid for him by Stephanopoulos to not call Putin a killer. Because even if there is a new Cold War, you would think that the U.S. would want to maintain some kind of diplomatic ties. I mean, this led to Russia withdrawing its ambassador in Washington. Russia said that relations with the U.S. are at a new low. But if you actually look at on social media as a gauge, like Blue Anon, what Aaron calls Blue Anon social media, like people who actually think that Maté is this brave and insightful truth teller, the reaction to the fallout of Russian-U.S. relations that Biden caused with that comment was good. Yes, that's great that he's doing this. This is what we've wanted, because that's the evil regime that installed Donald Trump and is responsible for, everything bad that happens.
Yeah, I saw some prominent Blue Anon member being like, finally, a president who stands up for Putin. Like, this is what I live for. And this is what liberal America has become. It's completely subsumed by Cold War mania. And so using Trump as a foil for that was so genius by the hawks in Washington and neoliberal elites, because Trump is so despised. So they were able to use him to advance a far right agenda that is threatening, danger for the entire planet. It reminds me of it was destructive in so many ways. We were talking before about the weapon sales to Ukraine. When Trump briefly put those on pause in the incident that ended up getting him impeached, one of the reasons why there started being concern inside the U.S. government was because they started getting calls from the defense industry. A Pentagon official named Laura Cooper testified about this. She said various folks in the Pentagon got calls from industry, and they were starting to get concerned. So that's actually an underrated aspect of that first Trump impeachment, which is that the sort of like the controversy that started internally inside the government was generated by military contractors who were getting concerned that these weapons that they sell to Ukraine were on pause for a brief review. And that's what then liberals were enrolled in defending, not in defending healthcare or fighting Trump's upward transfer of wealth with the tax heist, but defending our ability to send weapons to Ukraine, make money for arms manufacturers, arm neo-Nazis, and threaten war with Russia.
Yeah, it reminds me of the time that the Revolutionary Communist Party of the mysterious Bob Avakian went out and protested the firing of Jeff Sessions as DOJ. And there was some liberal activist, I forget who it was, but the word grifter is often overused, but it fits him. I forget his name right now, but he actually got arrested as well. He's like, I'm putting myself on the line for democracy because Jeff Sessions is being pushed out.
Well, I mean, it wasn't just the RCP, which is easy to make fun of because it's a bizarre cult, but as Aaron often points out, if I'm not mistaken, that was the largest liberal protest during the Trump administration, right? It was a protest in defense of a Klan sympathizer.
Yeah. Bigger protest to save Jeff Sessions' job than to save the Iran nuclear deal. I think even to save Obamacare, certainly bigger than to protest Trump's tax cuts for the wealthy, the biggest upward transfer of wealth in U.S. history. More liberals came out to save Jeff Beauregard Sessions' job.
Well, yeah, that's because they're like move on bots. Like move on pushes a button and the bots come out. I tried to go to one of those protests early on because I thought it was against the Muslim ban, and I was opposed to that. And I went out and I thought it was going to be a normal protest, and I was seeing all of these. This was like early on, all of these anti-Russian signs that I've never seen before, and all of these it was like Day of the Dead. And these people were literally had signs that said, when can we go back to brunch? And, I remember, the march went to Trump Hotel, and there were a few metal barricades around Trump Hotel, and a few of us went to remove the barricades just to take the protest to the steps. I mean, no laws were broken or anything. And as I was pulling back a metal barricade so people could just gather on the steps and put this like blue and non-liberal vigilante ran up to me, and he was like, he jumped in front of me really aggressively, and he said, "This is not who we are."
Well, don't forget, these are the same people who pride themselves on being like so open-minded and LGBTQ friendly, and they were all like, Trump's gay with Putin. Oh, yeah. I mean, I saw so many variations. I have to admit, it's actually international. I was at like this hipster cafe in Quito, Ecuador, and which is like the kind of like liberal imperialist types who support this candidate Yaku Perez, and I saw a variation on this. Yeah, I saw a variation on the same sticker of Trump kissing Putin in Ecuador. I mean, it just shows like how insane that narrative was and how international it became.
Yeah, remember Sean Spicer, how he was the like national enemy, and like everyone forgot about him. He's gone because he's like, he probably said Trump is an authoritarian or something, and like he got a job at Harvard afterwards, that great institution that kicked Cornel West out. But Sean Spicer, when he was like the target of liberal wrath, Saturday Night Live did this sketch of him and Trump being evildoers together, and at the end they just started making out. So like the comic punchline was, it turns out they're gay and that's bad. It was I'm like,
well,
what is
well,
this?
and if we're talking about Sean Spicer, we have to talk about his top moment as spokesperson when he said that when the Trump administration was accusing the Syrian government of using chemical weapons, and he said, even Hitler didn't use chemical weapons.
Oh my God.
That was peak Sean Spicer right there.
And that's when liberals cheered. That's when liberals put
Yeah,
the
they were like,
Putin like fear campaign on pause and applauded as Trump bombed Putin's ally in
yeah, I
Syria.
don't remember an ADL denunciation of that or anything. It was just kind of like we were just in our own little crazy corner yelling about that being kind of offensive. But let me just quickly, because I think it's relevant to the domestic constituency that was cultivated to support war footing with Russia, which is that a lot of the hysteria or no, the imagery around Putin and Trump being gay took the form of Putin actually being the macho top and Trump being the bottom. And I remember there was a mural or a hologram image that went up in the West Village, which showed Putin behind Trump, and Trump was actually a pregnant woman. And so Putin had actually impregnated Trump and totally dominated him. And the empire was being weakened by this closet homosexual president in an area where people really do have skin in the imperial game. I mean, the heart of the Acela corridor. So that was where that homophobia stemmed from.
Well, I have it up right now, and it says #love through hate.
Yeah. Oh yeah, love through hate too. Like it has one of those empty like boilerplate slogans where like the people put on their Priuses, like fight hate, like stop hate, like that, like hate. Imagine this elusive concept can be stopped, because like liberalism always aims to create problems that can't be solved instead of changing actual material conditions. But the point was, we are being violated and our empire is being weakened by this effeminate closet homosexual president. And so that fed into Biden coming up there, like hepped up on, I don't know what amphetamine, where he would like run. Remember, he would start running up on stage in his early speeches, like scampering up on stage to his acceptance speech. And he would kind of read in a drone-like fashion the script. And I was impressed that he was able to actually just get through the teleprompters. But then out of nowhere, he turned bellicose, and he would say, "I will restore international order. I will restore order." He sounded like an angry father. It's like probably what Hunter Biden had to deal with as a young man. And that was him signaling to that Russiagate domestic base that like, I'm not going to let Putin anally violate me as Trump did. And of course you're not allowed, you call that homophobic and everyone would just say you're crazy, but I saw it as such.
By the way, to put that mural in the West Village, what's in the West Village? It's the Stonewall Inn.
Yeah.
The site of,
it was up in Chelsea.
Like, so and then to have that so accepted, I don't remember there being opposition to that or people pointing out the homophobia. And on top of that, the irony of putting that in the birthplace, in the city where a movement against homophobia began, where people sacrificed their lives, at the Stonewall Inn uprising. It all flew over everyone's radar.
Synonymous with the sort of normalization of gay life to the point where, the gay pride parade in Washington, D.C. features float after float of Beltway bandits, like the Halliburton float, the Raytheon float.
Wow.
Then you have all the openly gay D.C. cops marching. And there's sometimes a small contingent that's like the queer anti-war contingent that rejects all of that. But for the most part, it's like the imperial gay pride parade. It's kind of disturbing.
Listen, since we're making fun of different liberal groups, liberal homophobes, liberal Russophobes, since we mentioned Ecuador, Ben, should we talk about the academics who attacked you for calling out the fake eco-socialist Ecuadorian candidate, and now his VP is now backing the right-wing candidate?
Yeah, I mean, I can briefly address it. I mean, we're going to cover this more. The election, the second round of the election is coming up this upcoming week in Ecuador. So we'll come back to this story. So I'm not going to spend too much time, but this is actually a good segue, because this has been the latest in a series of very angry open letters attacking us, because that's all of these toothless academics. They can't refute anything that we report. because it's factual. So they resort to these ridiculous smear campaigns, and because they're academics, the first thing they think is like, "Oh, what can we do? Oh, let's do an open letter, and we'll do an open letter calling for us to be deplatformed or whatever." And one of the latest is that a series of academics, including many of them who actually supported the very far-right military coup in Bolivia in 2019, published this open letter, and this is not a joke, smearing me and the Grayzone as an extension as racist and sexist,
anti-Semitic,
because we criticized this fake left-wing candidate Yaku Perez, and as you can see here on the screen, this guy with the leather jacket, he's standing next to the U.S. ambassador to Ecuador, who's his close friend, and you can see him holding like the U.S. flag.
Having a nice laugh, having a nice chuckle.
Yeah, and so I did these reports just showing how Yaku Perez, this fake left candidate, has supported numerous right-wing coups across Latin America. He was also asked in a debate, the leading candidate in the Ecuadorian election, who won the first round of the election in February in a landslide, is a socialist named Andrés Arauz, and he follows in the footsteps of the former president Rafael Correa and his movement. It's called the Citizens Revolution. And Andrés Arauz has proposed a lot of very ambitious socialist policies, including one of the first things that he said he wanted to do is give $1,000 checks to 1 million poor and working class families in Ecuador, which is a lot of money in Latin America, $1,000. In the context of the U.S., that would be like several $1,000s adjusted for.
That would be like the actual Biden stimulus.
Yeah, so Yaku Perez was asked in this interview if he supported that policy, and he said no, because if you give poor people all that money, they'll just spend it all on beer in one night. So this guy is a total fake left candidate. But anyway, so his wife, you can see in these photos, is also a very prominent Brazilian French academic who has a lot of links to Western regime change institutions. She teaches in the United States. I showed in my reporting also how she, as a very high-profile critic of the left-wing Correa government, she intentionally violated the law doing civil disobedience to get herself deported because she was on a tourist visa, and you can't violate the law and participate in civil disobedience on a tourist visa. So then she got herself deported and turned herself into this martyr, and the European Union testified in her behalf. She started getting all these grants from these Western government-funded fake human rights organizations, including an organization that was created by the European Commission as an arm of its soft power. And anyway, so I mean, it's a clearly bogus operation. But then a bunch of these coup-supporting academics published this ridiculous open letter, not challenging a single fact that I reported, of course, because they never do that.
They never
Instead
do.
of smearing me as sexist and racist. And I have to say, the irony of this is that right after a few days after this dumb open letter came out, Yaku Perez went on Facebook and he basically called for another coup, but this time he called for a coup inside Ecuador. He called for the military to intervene in the election to nullify the first round of the results that he lost and to do a whole new election that would disqualify the leftist candidate, Andrés Arauz. So this is the coup plotting candidate that all these Western liberal academics threw their weight around. And I'll just add one other funny detail about this. One of the people who signed this letter is this critical theorist and gender theorist, Judith Butler. She signed the original letter smearing us as racist and sexist. And when I emailed her with a request for comment saying, this guy you were defending, Yaku Perez, just called for a military coup and nullifying the election results. Do you still support him? And immediately, Judith Butler threw him under the bus and said, This is an exact quote, "Please know that I do not support the coup or the current president. My concern was only to defend ecofeminism as I know it, the important work on indigenous cultures and languages. I have been dismayed to learn that my signing of the document translates into support for Yaku Perez. I do not support Yaku Perez and never have." If you read the letter, it says explicitly that we as supporters of Yaku Perez and the movement he represents. So, I mean, it shows that at the same time, I think a lot of these academics barely even read the open letter that they're signing because it's not about what it actually
Keep that
says.
in mind
It's
for
about,
later, everybody. Keep that
yeah,
observation in mind for later. That will come
it's
up
about
again.
being in the club and smearing the people who are seen as toxic, like us.
Yeah, it's about getting your name out there and totally signaling. It's virtue signaling, but signaling your worthiness to the people who are getting ahead. And we don't come from academia. But yeah, she didn't read the letter. I actually corresponded with Judith, who I wasn't like friendly with her, but I'd been in touch with her before because she was a supporter of, I thought she was a supporter of Palestine and BDS. I mean, I was kind of dismayed to see her donating money to Kamala Harris, who's like one of the most pro-Israel candidates in history. But nevertheless, I said, you signed a letter that called my colleague an anti-Semite and a sexist and a racist. Did you read the letter? And she said, I think that I was like too hasty. So there you have it. And, no one else is really going to be held to account because of this hermetic academic world they live in, where you actually gain momentum in your career by denouncing the evil gray zone. I mean, I saw some NACLA editor, some editor from this academic, what used to be a left-wing academic publication, NACLA, attacking us for our coverage of Bolivia. That she was like saying what we're like performative or something, and like, what
well,
did
no,
we do?
She's one of those people who says that it wasn't a coup. I mean, these fake leftists who say it wasn't a coup and that Evo Morales was a dictator and that the social movements of Bolivia, for some reason, opposed Evo Morales, even though the MAS party has won the last 2 elections in a massive landslide. I mean, this is her. And the best part about her tweet is she didn't even write. She was afraid of writing Grayzone, so she put like you would write like a cuss word or something. She put like the asterisks.
Yeah. I thought.
But listen, Ben, go to her follow-up.
I thought she was talking about the grizzle yard or something. I didn't know it was the gray zone until someone pointed out.
Or Godzilla.
Yeah.
Ben, go to her follow-up tweets because they're so funny. So she says
she
nothing.
Blocked me.
Oh, okay. Yeah, she blocked me too.
As soon as I mean, so.
But anyway, what's so funny about her tweets is she's like, okay, yeah, I'm just getting started. I could say so much more. Believe me, trust me. But she's saying nothing. She offers like no criticism whatsoever. But she's doing this thread like, yeah, it gets worse. Trust me. Oh, you think Grayzone's good? No, trust me, they're bad.
It gets worse. Let me tell you what they did. They went to El Alto and they interviewed survivors of the Sencata massacre carried out by a right-wing US-backed coup regime that mowed down indigenous protesters in the streets. And they went there and talked to them and gave them voice. And that at a time when the interior minister of Bolivia was threatening them with deportation, that was so performative and wrong. Like, how dare they? That's like, what did we do wrong? Like in Bolivia, like I get their whole phony thing of authoritarianism in Venezuela or whatever. Like Venezuela's been so thoroughly demonized in media, but to be attacked by a NACLA editor for opposing the coup in Bolivia it just speaks to the complete intellectual and moral bankruptcy of all of these climbers in academia who say they're like, we're fighting neoliberalism and we're eco-socialists. And then here you have like the candidate that if they were like all voters in Ecuador, he would win in a landslide. He is them. He married one of them. Like his wife is this fake eco-socialist former Jeb Bush staffer, Manuela Pique. And we're talking about Yaku Perez, the kind of third place spoiler candidate in Ecuador. His wife was a staffer for Jeb Bush. She was helping to negotiate the free trade area of the Americas, which was one of the worst assaults on Latin American workers in recent history.
And which led to the creation of the Bolivarian Trade Alliance, the ALBA. Right. It was because it was called the ACLA, which was the U.S. trade deal. So then they made the ALBA.
Right, exactly. And then there's this fraud, Yaku Perez. I mean, this guy is such a fraud. Like he used to campaign, like he has like a ponytail and he rides a bicycle and tries to look like this indigenous hipster. But he used to campaign as Carlos Perez with like a clean shave and glasses. And he had like just like a normal haircut. He looked like a generic Latin American candidate. And then all of a sudden he changes it. It's like he had a midlife crisis, like things weren't going well for him. And he changes his look to like meet like hipster women or something. I don't know what he was trying to do, but this is like the figure that they're getting behind. And it's so obvious what his agenda is. His agenda is to split the left, to paint the socialist candidate as a state capitalist who's going to exploit the environment and to weaken international solidarity with Latin America. And he's backed by the U.S. His party has been backed by the U.S. government. It just doesn't get more naked. So
trained
yeah.
by the U.S. government.
Trained by the U.S. government.
His wife I just want to say really quick.
Like,
I just want to say really quickly. I think the main reason, honestly, that they published. I mean, they published that article for a few reasons, but the thing that pissed them off the most is this is a 6,000 word article. I mean, to Max's chagrin, you all know that I overwrite. I have way too much research in a lot of these pieces.
I'm the editor, so it's like, am I gonna like do anything with my day? Oh, I got a piece of pen. I got Gareth Porter's like forensic takedown of something, like,
Well, but I think the main reason they wrote that letter is there's one line in this 6,000 word article, and that's what pissed them off the most. And it was this line. Today, I talk about how I document without a doubt. I mean, you cannot dispute these because these are facts. You cannot dispute them. So the fact that her work her anti-Korea work in Ecuador was funded by Western governments, Taiwan. I mentioned Soros, and you can never mention Soros in a bad way. Peace be on him, because he's like a good billionaire. But anyway, that's what led them to spear me as an anti-Semite, which is insane. But anyway, the point is that I think the real reason they called me a sexist is because of this line. So keep in mind, this is someone who supported the Bolivia coup, who has been supporting right-wing opposition forces in Ecuador. But today she is a professor of Latinx and Latin American studies at Amherst College in the United States, and is the author of books with titles like Queering Narratives of Modernity, Sexualities in World Politics, and Sex and Tongue in International Politics. That's what pissed them off. It's because they said I was sexist because I was pointing out, they said that was gendered and misogynist or whatever. But no, what I'm pointing out is that these are rad libs. These are intersectional imperialists. These are people who support racist colonialist coups backed by the United States and backed by the Trump administration, while they talk this language about intersectionality and LGBT rights, while they're supporting right-wing forces, objectively right-wing forces. I mean, it's the biggest farce, and it's just like Hillary Clinton saying that we can't break up the banks because it won't end racism.
It reminds me of the paper, which was the winner of the Enloe Award in 2014 by Kara Daggett. It's called Drone Disorientations, How, quote unquote, Unmanned Weapons Queer the Experience of Killing in War. And it's a defense of drones because they're unmanned and therefore queer.
What if that's a self-parody? Like they got in there and they decided to drop this. Like sometimes people do that in academia. They'll drop these fake papers to see if it gets
real. I mean, unless I'm like completely being, it's in the International Feminist Journal of Politics.
That's hilarious.
Volume 17, 2015. The first line, amazing. Killing with drones produces queer moments of disorientation.
Oh my God.
Well, I got to keep going. Drawing on queer phenomenology, I show how militarized masculinities function as spatio-temporal landmarks that give killing in war its orientation and make it morally intelligible.
That's got to be a joke. That's got to be a joke. That's amazing.
It has to be real. I mean, given the state of academia, I mean, honestly, you could take all of these institutions and all of the people in it and just defund them completely and force them to like work frontline jobs, like being Uber Eats drivers, and we would lose nothing as a society. We would actually probably gain a lot as a society. Like, I know I sound anti-intellectual, but like these people can't even write. Like if I edited them, I would just throw out their I would never accept anything by them. Every word with them, it's like they can't say colonial. It has to be the coloniality. Like they just make up words. They can't write basic language. They didn't learn their 3 R's. And
Max's bodies and spaces.
Everything is bodies and spaces and Foucaultian biopolitics. And it basically, and then their politics always resort to some kind of moral posturing that leads you into this neither nor dynamic when it comes to empire, where like the target of empire is equal because it's authoritarian or masculine, whatever, autocratic, state capitalist, whatever it is, that it's something that we either have to oppose or support. We can't just take that out of the equation and oppose the empire that you exist in the center of, in an academic institution that is funded and created by these imperial elites. You can't even recognize that. So it's neither nor. Then they ultimately suppress any opposition and leave you with a character like Yaku Perez, who is the neither, who represents the empire. Like, ultimately, they always wind up supporting the empire. I mean, a perfect example is like the ultimate rad lib, Molly Crabapple, who, you know, just basically openly supports all of these military interventions, particularly in Syria, and who is an Eric Schmidt fellow at the New America Foundation, a Democratic Party think tank funded by the State Department. Eric Schmidt is like the ultimate surveillance capitalist. He's the CEO of Google, and like this guy who has this phony like Burning Man for billionaires in the desert. So like I just can't even like speak anymore when I think about these characters.
Well, you know,
it leads us to another open letter, but
I put, Ben, in the chat a tweet that is related to what Max was talking about, because it reminds me when Max and Anya and Rania went to Syria, there was like this freak out from people like Molly Crabapple and also Clarissa Ward of
she
CNN.
Called me a Nazi. She called me Goebbels.
Yeah, Molly called you a Nazi. Clarissa Ward said that she was having palpitations and spasms of rage because Max was reporting from the capital of a country that the U.S. has been destroying for the last decade with a dirty war. And Max was speaking to people who live under the control of their own government and who are living in the territory where most Syrians live. And I've never seen a case where journalists are targeted and elicit such a reaction just for the crime of visiting a country. Like, we go to Venezuela, go to Ecuador, go to Nicaragua, go to Syria, and it's like, that's a crime in itself. We can't even go there. We can't even talk.
They also say we're being paid by those governments to be there, like, because they project their own mercenary tendencies.
Exactly.
Yes, exactly.
Like that, they think that's how everyone must operate because that's how they operate.
Yeah, yeah.
I just want to point this out really quickly before we transition to Syria, because Max was talking about postmodern philosophy and academics. There's a really good scholar. I mean, there are a few people left in academia who are good. I can count them in my hands, but one of them is Gabriel Rockhill, who's an excellent scholar, and he's done a lot of research actually on how the CIA and other Western governments were actually supporting the rise of these postmodern movements like Deleuze and Guattari, like Foucault, because they were ardent anti-communists. And he has this really good piece, The CIA Reads French Theory on an Intellectual Labor of Dismantling the Cultural Left. There's also a really good book, I mean, kind of the canonical book, The Cultural Cold War, which is very closely tied to all of that. But I think Syria is such a good example of that.
I want to jump in really quickly. I'm glad you brought that up, Deleuze and Guattari. I'm not saying that they are, you know, they wrote this with the intention of having it used this way, but the Israeli Army Chief of Staff, Aviv Kohavi, he was a student of Deleuze and Guattari, and he actually gave a series of presentations on how he led the assault on Nablus and its old city during the end of the Second Intifada in Palestine. And if you've ever been to the old city, it's very there are these narrow alleys and built up old buildings. And the Palestinian resistance was operating from there with the assumption that the Israelis would get caught in these alleys and they would be able to ambush them and overwhelm their operational military advantage. But Kohavi said that because he studied Deleuze and Guattari's War Machine, and he contrasted Palestinian society with its linear old cultural backwardsness with the postmodern swarming worm-like a non-linear war machine. And what the Israeli military proceeded to do was to actually invade those homes and avoid the alleys and then smash through the living rooms of entire families with explosives and sledgehammers to root out the Palestinian resistance. And he chalked it up to postmodern philosophy, this strategy. So he's since been promoted to Israeli chief of staff. And this kind of this kind of postmodern thinking was projected to show the cultural superiority of Israel over the Palestinians through this figure who's essentially a war criminal.
I had to read To Lose a Guitar in college, and I had no idea what they were talking about. So I'm lucky.
Yeah.
Most academics don't either.
I just remember
they
thinking,
name drop them.
I just remember thinking that my professor does not want to deal with real issues in the world. That was my takeaway. I was like, so I just have to read this and pretend that it means something. But I it's like, what? It had no connection at all to anything real, and it was just.
Well, it ultimately means something much more elementary than we want to admit.
Yeah.
It's like, what is Foucaultian biopolitics? It's like some people can be rendered subhuman by the dominating force. I mean,
yeah.
But it's a useful concept. Anyway.
And what's not often discussed is that toward the end of his life, I mean, he died very early in the rise of neoliberalism, but Foucault was very sympathetic to the rise of neoliberalism at the beginning because his philosophy was so geared around individuals and individual liberty and all of those things. So it's been useful. I mean, there's a reason that Foucault has just taken over the academy. I mean, this isn't also to mention, by the way, the recent revelations that a lot of people knew for a while, that he had a predilection for very young boys in Tunisia, and that was very likely a pedophile. But I mean, that's not surprising when we also know the history of French intellectuals.
Yeah, I mean, Dominique Strauss-Kahn found a lot of defenders among the French new philosophers who, I mean, they just look like a bunch of perverts. I mean,
what's his name? Like the guy who always has his shirt open?
BHL. I mean, that guy just,
Oh.
just looks like a perv as he defends Israeli apartheid in like every regime change war.
And Saudi Arabia. Bernard Henri Levy is a friend of the Saudis. I just got to
friend of the Rojava.
There he
just
is.
Because
there
Aaron mentioned it, I got to show.
Oh, there it is. Yes, there's that chest.
It's true.
Yes,
he always has his.
Does he shave his chest, or like, does he have it like waxed? Just what is that?
Have you guys seen that picture where he's in Libya and he stands up on his toes so that he looks even taller than the people he's posing with? I swear to God, it's a real picture. He stands up on his feet so he can look taller than these like poor little Libyans whose country he helped destroy.
Well, he apparently
just so he can express his colonial supremacy.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he played a serious role there. I mean, he was kind of Hillary Clinton's fixer. He introduced her to the kind of Libyan Transitional Council initially and got her on board and said, this is going to be another Rwanda unless the NATO intervenes.
That's it, Ben.
And then, in the end, he was asked, what, like years after Libya became a failed state, which was always the intention. I mean, it wasn't a failure of the US. This was actually a success. But, Libya became a failed state with, as Gaddafi predicted, open air slave auctions and a massive migration crisis. And they asked, there he is. He's
look at him.
Toes against. Yeah. So he towers over the natives.
And it's Kurdish leaders.
Let me ask the chat, because I saw somebody was complaining about Max's level. How is everyone sounding? Can you put in the chat how the audio is, and we can make adjustments accordingly? I hear everybody okay, but maybe it's different for the audience.
I mean, try to think of a better visual metaphor for European colonialism. This French blowhard who has never produced an intellectual thought in his life, who just vomits out propaganda to manufacture consent for every Western war, standing on his toes to try to look taller than these opportunistic Kurdish leaders that already have been selling out their people anyway. I mean, it's just like even his own, like even Western puppets he doesn't respect.
Yeah, is that Barzani's gang? Who is that?
I'm not
That's
sure.
a good question.
I'm not sure, but they always have the woman Kurd that's become the sort of new fetishization of the liberal imperialists like Hillary Clinton or Caroline Forrest, the editor of what's the Islamophobic French magazine, Charlie Hebdo. She also produced a film about the Kurdish women. Then you have Hillary Clinton and I think Chelsea, they're producing a film about Kurdish female fighters. And the Jacobin founders are producing a film about a white gender fluid savior who goes to fight in Rojava, basically doing the work of the U.S. Marines fighting with the, Kurdish autonomous fighters. So this is one of sort of the fetish of liberals and social democrats in the U.S. And here's BHL right in the middle of it. Why? Because BHL, he's at the end of the day, he's kind of an Israel lobbyist. And there's this longstanding relationship between Israel and the Kurds, because the Kurds are one of these groups that aims to create an ethno-state that fragments the Middle East and disrupts Arab nationalism, which is a longstanding goal of the Israel lobby.
It's Barzani's gang. And here you can
Barzani's
see this is a
Okay,
stock
I was wrong. I said
photo,
Libya, so obviously that's a mistake. I have to correct myself. It's not Libya. This is Iraq.
It might as, that's amazing.
But look at this. This is
far away. His
Barzani's
shirt looks so much worse from far away. But Ben, who is Barzani? Go off.
No, there's not just one Kurdish leadership. The Kurdish community is split across 4 countries, and Barzani, of all of the Kurdish leadership in Iraq, is by far the most opportunistic. Openly supported the Iraq War. Openly collaborates with Israel. It's so pitiful. And again, just like the fact that it's incredible that in this photo they also cut off his feet, so you can't see that he's on his tiptoes. So he actually does look inhumanly tall.
and BHL, he's such a good example of how awful so much of that 60s generation that sold out is. Like the new French intellect, Alain Finkielkraut, he became this fire-breathing racist, but they were all Trotskyists in the 60s, and they became disillusioned by 1968, and then they began to believe that defending the establishment was the only way forward. I think, they provide a basis for understanding a lot of the academics that signed the letter attacking you, Ben, or signed the Syria letter, who they start out radical, or they want to present radical, but ultimately they defend the establishment, reap the benefits. And the French New Philosophers, they're just flaunting it. They remind me a lot of the U.S. neoconservatives who used to be Trotskyists in the early 60s and late 70s, then turned on a dime either because of Israel or because of their belief that the Russian Jews had to be liberated. And then they constructed this false binary of democracy versus totalitarianism, in which the Western world had to intervene to fight this civilizational battle. And I think, I can see so many people who go through this process, starting out radical in my generation, and even in the millennial generation. You can kind of see this trajectory, because how are you going to make a career otherwise?
So the consensus on the audio is that Max, it's fine, or some people are saying Max is a little bit low.
All right.
I raised it a bit.
Oh, you raised? Okay.
I turned up my gain. And
let me read a couple of super chats, and then we can think about what we're going to move on to next, because we had so many topics that we haven't even addressed yet. We've already been going an hour. So Zippity Day, here's a high compliment for any lefty. I turned off Jimmy Dore to listen to your mantle. Thank you, Zippity. King of the Catnap. Sup, y'all? Thank you, King. And now all the super chats disappeared. That's all I got for now. I'll find the rest.
Marsupial is good. It's like a marsupial, and they have like a emoji.
Oh, marsupial. Okay. That's good. And the rest of them just disappeared, but I'll get them back.
Get them back.
So since we're talking about open letters, sellout academics, should we move on to Syria? And there was a recent attack on the Grayzone in a form of an open letter that wouldn't have gotten any attention if it were not signed by Noam Chomsky, surprisingly. Now, it didn't directly name the Grayzone. There's actually an interesting story there, which we'll get into. But it's an amazing occurrence that, as right now, after a 10-year dirty war, the U.S. is occupying 1/3 of Syria, is imposing what Patrick Coburn of The Independent calls the worst sanctions in the world on Syria that are preventing it from rebuilding, are preventing it from importing food and medicine, preventing Syrians from even importing toothpaste because it's been labeled a dual-use good, which means that toothpaste could be used to brush your teeth, but it also could be used supposedly for military purposes. Doctors have to smuggle in medical equipment to fix their broken parts. So in the midst of this, while all this is happening, this open letter comes out that instead of talking about this and what we can do to stop the continued torment of Syria, it attacks people on the left, what it calls the anti-imperialism of fools, and accuses us all of being Assadists and apologists for Iran and also for Chinese imperialism. I didn't know that China was an imperial power inside of Syria. That was news to me. And when it gets to the U.S. role, it says that it's, quote, not central. So a multi-billion-dollar dirty war, one of the most expensive covert programs in the CIA's history, according to the New York Times, one that helped kill over 100,000 soldiers, according to U.S. officials who privately bragged about it to the Washington Post. And now a military occupation that controls Syria's wheat reserves, controls its oil, and crippling sanctions. And this letter is saying that the U.S. role is not central. And again, it wouldn't matter except for being another example of this academia culture that we're talking about, of people coming up with these fancy ways to justify imperialism. But it got the signature of Noam Chomsky, which is and that's what got it some kind of cachet. And the story behind that is interesting, which I'll talk about. But maybe, Max, you want to talk about this letter and your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I actually knew about the letter early on. I'm trying to remember the name. I've gone through so many names right now that I'm like, I'm going to actually bring up my own Twitter thread on it. But
well, Max is bringing that up. I think one of the first things that we should point out is it was published on this website called Al-Jumhuriyya, which means republic in Arabic. And this is a website that is funded by the European Endowment for Democracy, by the way, which is it's the European Union's equivalent of the United States government's National Endowment for Democracy, which, as any frequent the Grayzone reader would know, is a CIA cutout spun out of William Casey's CIA under the Ronald Reagan administration. So the European Union made its own version, which is an arm of soft power for the EU, and it funds this website. And all they do is just attack the anti-war left, attack the anti-imperialist left nonstop.
Yeah, I mean, it's obvious what their agenda is, and it's like it's serving a very important purpose. And it's the website of Yassin al-Hajj Saleh, who is this Syrian intellectual he lives in Turkey now, and he's a lot like the French New Philosophers that I described, like a former radical, former Marxist who parades around as a Marxist while attacking every Marxist who opposes the dirty war on Syria. And basically, he literally was a U.S. informant, like so many of the kind of turncoat figures in Lebanon who became U.S. assets, like Lokman Slim, who recently died in a mysterious incident. But al-Hajj Saleh, he's like the guru of all of these Syria regime changers in the academy, particularly in the UK. He was profiled, I think, in the New Yorker as this great hero, and he gets to write all these New York Times op-eds, but he was literally a U.S. government informant in WikiLeaks State Department cables that appeared on WikiLeaks. You can see him advising the U.S. Embassy in Damascus on how to form a coalition with Islamists as far back as 2006, which is why I always say, like, there was no 10th anniversary of the Syrian conflict. Syria's been under attack for decades. But anyway, that's who provided.
Well, I just want to point out really quickly, because you mentioned this is a WikiLeaks cable. The same people attacking us and allying with Yassin al-Hajj Saleh, who is a U.S. embassy informant, they're also the same people who attack Julian Assange. And there's a reason that they attack him. They smear him with all these different ways. No, they hate Julian Assange and WikiLeaks because it exposed their heroes like Yassin al-Hajj Saleh to be direct collaborators with the U.S. government.
Yep. Is just he was just caught with his pants down. And then you have Gilbert Ashkar. So I learned about this because Ashkar was circulating the letter for signatures. I have the email where he is, volunteering to circulate it. Who is Gilbert Ashkar? He is a Lebanese Trotskyist didn't support. He kind of issued the call among academics for a no-fly zone in Libya. Then he called for, and he said his argument was so ridiculous. He said, if we support a no-fly zone in Libya, then we can call for the same in the Gaza Strip to prevent Israel from bombing Gaza. That NATO is then going to turn around and say, wait a minute, we should do that there too because civilians are suffering. Yeah, we're just like an honest broker who applies the same standards to all people across the Middle East. Complete clown. Supported the same in Syria. His book, Arabs and the Holocaust, which paints Syria in particular and the Syrian government as sort of a base of Holocaust denial, was published in Hebrew by an Israeli publishing house that is, just a complete violation of the BDS call as well as the official Lebanese boycott. And everyone who signed this letter violated the Lebanese boycott. So all of the Arab academics who signed this letter violated the Lebanese boycott because it forbids working with Israelis, and many Israelis signed this letter as well. And these were like Israeli anarchists and Trotskyists who I have known, and they finally got to find common cause with Netanyahu by taking the Israeli position on Syria. Almost the entire Israeli radical left has taken the position of the Israeli military intelligence apparatus on Syria. It's pretty amazing to see. There's almost no one in the Israeli left who opposes Israel, paying Wahhabi Salafi factions in the Golan, in the occupied Golan, giving them logistics and money, bombing Syria hundreds of times. None of them oppose it. None of them protest it. So, then beyond that, the letter, as Ben pointed out, was...
And I just want to point out really quickly that Netanyahu himself has admitted that Israel has attacked Syria hundreds of times. It's actually more like thousands. So, these people, it's not hyperbolic at all. It's not like it's a secret. The Israeli government boasts that it has attacked Syria hundreds of times.
Yeah.
And not just Syria now, but also Iranian ships trying to deliver fuel to break the blockade of Syria, to help it, give people its basic needs. So now Israel's committing acts of terrorism, a lot of them on the open seas, trying to destroy these ships that are trying to bring fuel to Syria.
Yeah.
Well, and finally, there's so much to mention here, but really quickly, just while you mentioned Gilbert Ashkar, who is this British Lebanese scholar, he also has, as we documented at the Grayzone, I got access to these documents showing how he trained this elite UK military unit. And it's incredible. This is a guy who calls himself a Marxist. He's known as an academic, as a Marxist, which is insane. He's deeply anti-Marxist in so many ways. And he has actively, on multiple occasions, trained an elite UK military unit. That's just not support. That's not only support for imperialism. That's direct collaboration with imperialism. It's one thing even to sign an open letter, but this guy trains soldiers.
Yeah, and so did Helen Lackner, who was also signatory of the letter. And it's just amazing. These people pose as leftists and they're literally training an elite unit in the British military. It just doesn't get any more naked than that. But the point is here that the US is strangling Syria's economy. The Caesar sanctions have caused a fuel crisis to the point where the roads of Damascus are emptying out. People are forced to stay home. Workers cannot go to their jobs. Who cares about the politics? This is about people. It's about working people being completely destroyed. And the proxy war on Syria, one of the things I got to do when I was in Syria is meet Syrian workers who told me about how they faced car bombings, attacks while they were on their way to their jobs, while they were trying to go to the hospital, for example. They lost their legs. Everyone was suffering so much under this proxy war. And it was just common workers. And now none of them can even take public transportation, or few of them can take public transportation. There's rationing across the country. Americans don't know what it's like. to experience that. And this is what the US specifically has brought to Syria. You have Joel Rayburn, who is the liaison to Syria under Trump, boasting that he tanked Syria's currency. And now it's now what, 4,000 to the dollar, 4,000 Syrian pounds to the dollar. That's a boast that he made on Twitter. I mean, that is
James Jeffrey, the Trump on
James Jeffrey.
No. So Rayburn, who you mentioned, he boasted about plunging the currency, and then James Jeffrey, the Trump envoy to the anti-ISIS coalition, so-called, he boasted in Foreign Affairs that U.S. sanctions crushed Syria's economy. That's a direct quote. So we have U.S. officials openly bragging about destroying a country's economy after a decade-long dirty war that we were a big part of. And you have this letter coming out, not attacking them, but attacking the anti-imperialists who are trying to call attention to it. And what's funny about this story, there's a backstory. So Gilbert Ashkar, who you mentioned, he was a big organizer of this, and he is responsible for sending it to Chomsky. And I don't want to reveal everything that I talked about, that I discussed with Chomsky about this, because I don't want to.
But you had a conversation with Noam Chomsky about his signing of this letter.
Yeah, so afterwards I wrote him, and we had a long exchange. And the point is, so initially that open letter included all of our names, included you two, me, Rania, Anya, it named the Grayzone, it named other websites too, it named even some U.S. peace groups, like people like PSL, anti-war groups. And so Noam said that he refused to sign it. And so at that point, if Gilbert and the other organizers really felt strongly about calling us out, why didn't, they should have said to Noam, I think, sorry, but like we believe so strongly that these people are destructive. We're going to leave it in, so we can't have your signature. But Gilbert and the other organizers caved immediately and took out all of our names, because for obvious reasons, if they had just signed it, nobody would have cared. But getting Chomsky's signature carries some kind of weight on the left. And the reason Chomsky says he signed it is that it didn't attack anyone personally and was just expressing a general principle of support for the Syrian people who rose up against Assad, and is criticizing people who try to minimize their uprising. And, we can get into all that, and we had a long back and forth and blah, 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 blah. I mean, I try to point out that the tactics of this letter are the same tactics that were used against him his entire career, with like McCarthyite insinuations that he's really a dupe of the Russians or whoever the enemy of the day is. In this case, this letter even threw in the Chinese, like is if China is somehow an imperialist power inside of Syria. That's what it tried to insinuate. But I didn't get very far in convincing him. And just what he said was he was expressing an abstract statement of principle. And he said that even if he knew that the originators wanted to attack him originally, he still would have signed it, because he just was expressing support for an abstract principle. So whatever. I think it was totally cowardly on Gilbert Ashkar's part, because I'd personally, if you're going to attack me, I'd much rather be named, so you can defend your characterization of me, defend your characterization of Ben Norton and Max Blumenthal, like show us where we're doing the things you accuse us of. But it was more important for them to get Noam Chomsky's signature than it was to actually stand behind their firm beliefs.
Well, I want to point out really quickly, this is the original letter that was going around. We got sent a copy of, and it has the top of it is this solidarity delegation, including Max, Rania, Anya,
and someone who was in Robben Island with Nelson Mandela from the ANC, among other figures.
Yeah, Ajamu Baraka, there's so many great people here. Like it's incredible that they're attacking basically the entire anti-war movement. And what's incredible about this photo, they use this photo to try to attack the Solidarity group. It says very explicitly, it's the Trade Union Forum for Solidarity with the Workers and People of Syria against the economic blockade, imperialist interventions, and terrorism. This is a labor union federation. That's what they're talking about. Like, it's so crazy. They're trying to make it like Assad himself personally invited you all to a candlelit dinner and tried to woo you or something.
Well, I don't want to get into the Syria trip too much. The Ba'ath Party basically controls the Syrian state. So, I knew that there were going to be attacks, but I wanted to go there and see what it was like in this place where most Syrians live, and I got to go off on my own. Me and Anya were off on our own completely. We had a Syrian American friend who's a businessman who actually initially supported a lot of the some of the protests against Assad early on, Naji, who was like, I mean, we didn't have a government fixer. It was him who was like, having dinner with us, and we stayed on our own in the old city. We had like no government fixers or no government oversight. We went wherever we wanted, saw whatever we wanted. And so the harm was that was the real like danger of our trip. That was the real threat of our trip. And like one of the points Naji would make was that, yeah, I supported what I thought was a reformist uprising. But then when I realized, like so many Syrians, like most Syrians, that where this was leading was to the complete dissolution and destruction of the state, I stepped out, and the so-called rebels destroyed my factory after making me swear that I was not an Alawite and say the Shahada. So, I met so many Syrians like that. So then I met people with diverse opinions who were very critical of the government and the president himself. But, the real threat was that we were talking to them, that we were having this dialogue. But back to Chomsky, I mean, this is the interesting part.
Well, quickly, just while I have this letter up, I mean, so we know the context of this letter because, as Aaron spelled out, the original letter named all of these people, and basically it's many of the most prominent figures in the United States and overall Western anti-war movement, along with basically all of the major anti-war groups in the United States. So they name us, and also Rania, who's not with the Grayzone, but she's a friend of us. They also name Tim Anderson, Caitlin Johnstone. They named the Working Group on Syria Propaganda. They name Mint Press News, Consortium News, Antiwar.com, Moon of Alabama, Jimmy Dore, and then they also name the U.S. Peace Council, Veterans for Peace, Workers' World, United National Anti-War Coalition, and Party for Socialism and Liberation. I mean, these are all of the major institutions in the anti-war left.
It's a McCarthyite blacklist. Yeah. And, the like British deep states, like Dirt Devil / Coffee Boy, Idris Ahmad, I'm sure had a role in it because he got really upset that those names were removed. Then he removed his tweet. That's like his role in life. I remember seeing a tweet by him. This is like the #1 online stalker of any anti-imperialist. He kind of plays the role on Twitter that the mysterious Philip Cross and Bob from Broccoli, who's actually an academic named Ben Gidley, play on Wikipedia. And I feel like there's some integrity initiative type operation going on there. I mean, he even phoned me, somehow got my phone number to threaten me before I published expose of the white helmets, threatening me against doing that. But I remember seeing a tweet by him once where he said, it's 5 a.m. and I have to be up writing a denunciation of Noam Chomsky for signing, I think it was signing one of the letters supporting the OPCW whistleblowers, which, Aaron, you can talk about in a second. But I mean, the key operative phrase there was, I have to be up at 5 a.m. It's like, it's his job to basically be a narrative manager and attack and intimidate anyone who violates the parameters of the British deep state's narrative. And so he was mad about this letter, removing that McCarthyite blacklist. And yet they got Chomsky to sign on to the letter. And I thought, yeah, that was important for them, but it was also important in the discrediting of Chomsky, because what they did was they got Chomsky to denounce himself as a traitor because he had been signing other letters in support of the whistleblowers who were calling out the Duma deception, this pro-war deception that Aaron has done a lot of work on. And I find it sad. I mean, how Chomsky's at the end of his life, he's establishing the final stage of his legacy, and he's contradicting himself. And what people need now is consistency and guidance. And there's been inconsistency throughout Chomsky's career. He's celebrated the fall of the Soviet Union, but then opposed the hegemonic New World Order that the U.S. imposed afterwards. He signed a lot of weird letters. He wrote a letter of support for the French Holocaust denier Robert Faurisson, but I can see how he could justify it on the basis of
he supported his freedom of speech. He supported his freedom of speech.
Chomsky's a free speech absolutist. I'm just saying he signed a lot of letters. Yeah. He, has been in the 90s, he was like one of the harshest public critics of the Democratic Party from the left. And he would mock people who would like defend Bill Clinton against the impeachment scam and all that. But now he's like attacking or criticizing people who don't vote for Biden on the left because they're supporting Trump. And, you know, he wears like goofy hats supporting Greta Thunberg. And it's just like it's not the Chomsky that I knew. I wonder what's
I just want to say this on public record. He's 92, and basically at this point, all the people like trying to use Chomsky to attack the anti-war movement, that's just like elder abuse at this point.
Well,
like,
you know what? Listen,
he's not as sharp as
I don't want to say that. I still think that he's really there. I don't agree with that.
I think he's totally there. And I have a more sympathetic view to him. Now, of course, he's the most influential intellectual on me, a profound impact on my life and thinking about the world. So I'm very biased when it comes to him.
Me too.
But you know, I don't think we need to get into too much of analysis of him. I'll just say from his point of view, I got from talking to him that he was very influenced by going to Lebanon and meeting with members of the anti-government movement who had fled to Lebanon, who felt betrayed by the world and wanted more support. And I think you know, in the same way, Max, like you went to a refugee camp in Jordan and heard from all people who wanted the U.S. to bomb. So he met with people like that. And I think my takeaway was he was very impacted by that. And what I was trying to impart to him is I don't think he was taking into account what the impact was of the policies that ultimately he would be supporting if he went along with what those people wanted, which is the further destruction of the state. And that he also recognized that no state has a right to intervene in a country like Syria. So accordingly, where I think his blind spot is like he holds the Syrian government responsible for the most part for crimes that were committed as a result of a war that was imposed from abroad. And he conflates that with the very real protest for reform that arose in the early stages of 2011. And I think it's a blind spot. I think it's too bad, but I don't think he's still very, you know, he's still very principled when it comes to the OPCW whistleblowers, and he won't deny the reality of what the U.S. did. He just, for some reason, doesn't think it was as central as people like we do.
I question whether it's a blind spot, given previous positions he's taken. And, you know, when I was momentarily taken in by some of the opposition's narratives, I mean, I think I was inconsistent because I would go after the opposition for trying to push direct military intervention, but then I would make these sympathetic statements. And, you know, we did a whole Moderate Rebels episode on this and my evolution on Syria and Ben's evolution and Rania's as well. She was a guest. So you can check that out. I don't want to go into it too much, but I was in the process of evolution and understanding where the Arab Spring was leading us and seeing these states being broken down and seeing the destruction of entire societies and how it was, you know, playing out. And ultimately I think I was able to self-correct. It changed me a lot. And Chomsky for his part, I don't think he's obviously not in a process of evolution right now. Although, you know, Joseph Massad in a pretty scathing piece, which was initially published in Arabic and is now at Middle East Eye, pointed out that Chomsky, you know, has softened politically as he's much more close to the center than he was in the 1970s or even in the 1990s, but he is an anarcho-syndicalist. He's even written a book spelling out his anarcho-syndicalist ideology. And this is someone who therefore does not believe in states. He doesn't understand the importance, or he doesn't respect the importance of maintaining a state structure where if you do regime change in Syria, you're not just removing big bad Bashar al-Assad, you're actually dismantling an entire government and all of its ministries, which we're seeing, and we're kind of slowly seeing that unraveling through the sanctions, and the effect on civilians is devastating, same as what we saw in Libya. You can point to the Soviet Union too, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which he welcomed and celebrated, and we saw what happened to Russians in the 1990s. So I think it's not a bug, but an actual feature of his ideology. And it's something that Michael Parenti always criticized about Chomsky. And I say that as someone who really respects him, and he had an impact on me when I was younger and I was more coming from like a liberal background. But, I think at this point, I wish he could, self-correct instead of falling into these contradictions and traps.
Well, I think that's Chomsky's main utility. I mean, for me too, Chomsky is a good kind of gateway figure into anti-war politics, anti-imperialist politics, but he's often not consistent. But because he's not consistent, and because he's still a diehard anti-communist and has always been, he can help win over some more liberal people who become more sympathetic to leftist critiques, and then eventually they see his weaknesses. While also understanding that, Chomsky has done a lot of good things, but he definitely has some weaknesses.
All right, I think we're getting too far afield. I don't agree with your guys' characterization of him. I don't think you can call him, for example, a diehard anti-communist. I think he cheered the fall of the Soviet Union because he saw it as a system of...
This is a long conversation, but Aaron, he repeatedly referred to the Soviet Union as an open-air prison. I mean, Chomsky has been a lifelong diehard anti-communist.
He saw it as a system of tyranny. And
he called it an open-air prison. He called the Soviet Union an open-air prison.
Okay, I don't know that quote. I'll look it up. I promise I will.
Chomsky has done a lot of important things, and some of his books are very important.
He spent his life criticizing and being attacked by actual diehard anti-communists who wanted to silence him. So I just don't know if you can characterize him as a diehard anti-communist. He was critical of the Soviet Union.
Well, that's the irony of anti-communism is they always go. I mean, that's the irony of HUAC and all these institutions is they always go after people who are insufficiently anti-communist. But anyway, whatever.
I'm not going to criticize Chomsky for calling the Soviet Union a tyrannical system. It was. I mean, my father lived under it. So, and I don't think he ever minimized the crimes of U.S. imperialism and U.S. imperialism's role in actually making the Soviet Union even more authoritarian and actually preventing its development. He never minimized that. So anyway, but I think we're getting too far afield. What I think in this case is that, as I said, I think he sees this authoritarian in Syria, and he's conflated the real democratic sentiment that existed in those early months of 2011 with the dirty war that was imposed on Syria. And there's this tendency to hold Assad responsible solely for crimes that were committed as a result of a war that he did not start. And I think that Chomsky's fallen for that, and I think it's too bad. But I think it's worth debating. At the same time, Chomsky is still signing letters in support of the OPCW whistleblowers. If you were to ask him to sign a letter condemning the U.S. sanctions on Syria, he would. So I just think, I don't want to go to, I think this was awful, him signing this. And I told him that. But I personally will disagree. I don't go as far as you guys do in my critique.
Is Ajit Singh anywhere in the building, or what happened?
Yeah, I'll get Ajit on if you want to transition and conclude on Syria.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about it all night, but I think it's important to cover the China issue because that's the new chosen evildoer of our time, and you should put it on screen. Here, I'll send it to you. Right now, but there is a fairly new poll out by Gallup, and finds that there is a new high in perceptions of China as the U.S.'s greatest enemy. And only a few years ago, most Americans viewed China favorably. I think 2018. In February 2020. Only 22% of Americans viewed China as the greatest enemy. There was no clear consensus in the U.S. at that point on who the greatest enemy is. Now it's clearly China, and negative views of Russia have gone up. I think 3 out of 4 Americans see China and Russia in a very negative light now, which has gone up enormously in the past few years. So propaganda works. And the propaganda that we've been hearing most about China is very clever. It is designed to appeal to liberal sensibilities because it's much easier to get Republicans and the pro-Trump MAGA base on board with a campaign to demonize foreigners. And as I mentioned on previous live stream, like being at the Capitol on January 6th, what I heard more than, racist rhetoric or even anti-immigrant rhetoric per se, although it fits within the framework of anti-immigrant rhetoric, was anti-China rhetoric from the people storming the Capitol, to the point where they were even calling like DC police and Capitol police CCP police. So that was easy, but getting the liberals on board's been, it's a little bit different, a little bit tougher, because, liberals want to be sensitive about being racist, or, they try to at least present themselves as tolerant enough to look in the mirror and put like stickers on their cars that say "fight hate." But the narrative focuses on the human rights situation, specifically in Western China. This has gotten the most traction, more than Hong Kong. And it's about Uyghurs being put in concentration camps. It's about Uyghurs not only being put into forced labor, but Uyghurs being forced to pick cotton like slaves, which is just a really ironic accusation coming from the US. And Ajit Singh, who is a journalist and researcher and lawyer based in Toronto, has been really effective at picking these narratives apart. And as he's picked these narratives apart, and me and Ben have partnered with Ajit on several articles and, written our own articles, we've been getting denounced by more and more mainstream institutions. There was an attack on us in the Wall Street Journal 2 days ago, an attack on the Grayzone. The South China Morning Post featured an attack on us the same day. And the Australian Strategic and Policy Institute, which is this State Department and arms industry funded think tank that pushes a lot of this narrative about the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, they did an entire study on us, where, as with the Syrian open letter and the Ecuador open letter, no one disputes one single fact that we published. Nothing we published is ever disputed. What we're attacked for in this study, where we're mentioned something like 36 times, the Grayzones mentions 36 times, is who retweets us, because Chinese officials have retweeted some of our articles. So that's apparently a real crime and some fault of ours. I don't know if Ajit's there, but it would be great to get him in to talk about this. And his latest piece is really shocking, because he goes into the elements behind the recent heckling of an anti-racist rally in Washington against anti-Asian hate crimes by the Uyghur American Association, which is a US-funded Uyghur association that operates under the umbrella of the World Uyghur Congress, which is the main international Uyghur separatist organization. And they ran this, I don't know if Ben, you have the video you can show, but they ran this car caravan like right in front of this rally, screaming "Wipe out China," and just like denouncing these protesters. And the rally wasn't even about supporting China. So Ajit showed that, that this group is deeply invested in far-right Trumpist politics, and their leadership operates a militia-style gun club that trains with former special forces in advanced combat techniques in Northern Virginia. So I would love to get him in here to talk about it if he's
here. Yeah.
Welcome, Ajit.
Hey, Ajit.
In the
Can you
building.
hear us?
Yep.
Right on. So, Ajit, we've been getting it. We got attacked last year like 4 times. It was obviously a State Department coordinated attack, because one of the first publications to attack us was Coda Story, which is funded by the State Department and the National Endowment for Democracy in a semi-covert fashion. And then Bethany Allen Abrahamian, who's like this pal of Trump's kind of China media guy, Matt Pottinger, she chimed in at Axios. I found other attacks on us, but it was coordinated, and it was partly because of the work you were doing, starting with an article which is consistently one of our most popular articles, because I think so many people out there are questioning this narrative and wondering what the hell is going on, where you busted the claim by Adrian Zentz that over 1 million Uyghurs were in concentration camps in Xinjiang, and you went through his report and you showed who Adrian Zentz really was. So, let's start by talking about the centrality of this figure, Adrian Zentz, in the narrative, and how you got into ripping apart his studies. I worked with you on this. I questioned Zentz on Capitol Hill.
Like about 3-4 years ago, the sort of media reporting around Xinjiang started increasing in like the sharpness of the tone and depiction of what was going on there. And then seemingly out of nowhere popped up this former professor at a seminary in Germany who was starting to be quoted in piece after piece by like the Associated Press, New York Times, Washington Post as the sort of key headlining expert who's somehow who's like terrific scholarship is revealing atrocities in Xinjiang. And so looking into some of his background and who this person was, like for those of us on the left, seeing his affiliation with think tanks like the Jamestown Foundation and the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation sort of raises your attention. But then going into him, sorry,
who are they? Jamestown and Victims.
Oh, Jamestown was founded, I believe. It was linked with William Casey.
It was founded out of Bill Casey's CIA in the Reagan administration as a way of paying Soviet dissidents without doing it directly through the CIA.
Yeah, and the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, I think, was established in the early 90s by the U.S. government. And it's, as Max outlined in the piece we collaborated on, Zenz, it has a lot of roots in the sort of ultra-nationalist, anti-communist sort of forces in Central Europe and Eastern Europe. So yeah, basically you saw these claims being trotted around repeatedly and just accepted uncritically, and tried to look into that. And it was even surprising from my perspective, like the sort of lack of like strength behind the claims. So the two sources that have been now, like at this point, like the reporting is so circular that sources are just recycled and recycled and recycled, that it's just this sort of number that floats in the air that's just accepted. And it's like untethered from these people, I think, in most people's minds. But the actual like hard copy sort of foundation for these claims are a report by the Network of Chinese Human Rights Defenders, which is funded by the NED, and it features a lot of anti-communist Chinese dissidents.
Let's just explain like who the NED is. That's the National Endowment for Democracy.
The National Endowment for Democracy, which has like a long history of basically, in the words of its own sort of founding members, doing what the CIA did covertly, openly. And basically what it does is it funds a lot of sort of civil society or NGO groups that are promoting things that seem like very good, like democracy and human rights, but it's really a way for the United States government to funnel resources towards groups that advance the interests of U.S. foreign policy. A lot of these groups often support right-wing neoliberal economic policies and whatnot. So the NED was the financier of the one sort of human rights organization which is based in the United States, the Network of Chinese Human Rights Defenders. And when you look at that study, which was cited by the US representative on the UN Human Rights Council, Gay McDougall, in 2018, and then that sort of started the chain of reports which said the UN reports that China's detaining 1 million Uyghurs. And Ben and I wrote about that in 2018 to say that it wasn't the UN that said it, it was the US representative, and she was relying on these two people. So if you look at the Network of Chinese Human Rights Defenders, the basis of their claim, like the issue of genocide and discrimination is extremely serious. And if we are concerned about it genuinely, we should be extremely serious in how we verify those claims. So the Network of Chinese Human Rights Defenders did the extremely diligent, hard work of interviewing a total of 8 people, and then it averaged their estimates to come up with, which it then multiplied by the entire region's population. So like Max said, yeah, I think 10% of Uyghurs are detained, and Aaron says, I think 15, and Ben says 12, they just averaged that and multiplied it by Xinjiang's provincial or the region's population. And that's how they got to their figure. And they say this right in their report, as you can see on the screen. And then the other fellow is Adrian Zenz. And if you look at his work before getting into his background, just on the basis of his work, he cites a Newsweek Japan report as claiming to have come across leaked Chinese government documents, which state, I believe, the number that he said in his initial report. Like subsequently, he's increased his estimates over time. I think it's like 800,000. And so if you look at that Newsweek Japan report that Zenz cites, it's based on this exiled Uyghur television network based in Turkey, which, if we have an opportunity to talk about later, Turkey is sort of the foundation of the sort of international exiled Uyghur community. And this network features people like, as you see on the screen, Nureddin Yildiz, who goes on the network ranting and raving these fanatically anti-Semitic rants, saying that China's a nation of savages worse than the Jews. And this is the basis of Zen's estimate. So these are the two really incredibly solid sources for this extremely incendiary claim that has so many consequences in terms of international politics. And it's like, it's laughable. It's like hard to really put into words how ridiculous this is. And then if you go deeper, I don't know if anyone wants to jump in, but if you go deeper into Zenz, he's unheard of basically before 2016-17. I was doing some research through some newspaper archives recently, and I saw him pop up in a Washington Post article in the early 2000s as like a German exchange student who was volunteering with some sort of feed the homeless soup kitchen type thing. And so he, prior to his sort of newfound stardom as like international anti-communist rock star, he was teaching at a seminary, an evangelical seminary that thinks like Christianity is the only truth in Germany. And his previous like sort of high mark in scholarship, aside from some writing on Tibet, was this a book about the end times and like how sort of like the end times of the world from an evangelical Christian perspective. And he interprets the entire like geopolitical phenomena of the 20th century and like he offers his predictions of like the future course of the world and international relations through the lens of the Bible. And like he compares
why all believers will not be raptured.
Yeah.
With his father-in-law, who's this far-right evangelical preacher in Minnesota named Marlon Silas.
Yeah. And Zenz, at that time, like some of his biggest political causes are about how like gender equality and so-called tolerance thinking and anti-discrimination legislation are like manifestations of Satan. And he's really raging, it seems like, on the restrictions on the ability to spank children. He talks about the importance of spiritual spanking, which Max asked him about. Scriptural spanking, sorry.
I don't know if it has anything to do with like the spirit cooking like Podesta was into.
Well, really quickly, I want to point out that there's a commonality here between this kind of worldview where Adrian Zenz, the leading so-called fake expert on Xinjiang, who also fancies himself a fake expert on Tibet, he opposes gender equality just like Falun Gong. I mean, his ideas are actually really similar to one of the other main anti-China groups, the Falun Gong, which is also based in the United States. They also expressly oppose gender equality. They oppose interracial relationships. They oppose modern science. I mean, it's really a commonality linking a lot of these extreme anti-China forces.
Yeah, definitely. Like in the piece that just came out this week on the Wipeout China incident and the gun club that the U.S. government-funded National Endowment for, not National Endowment for Democracy, Uyghur American Association runs, they've partnered up with the Family Research Council in the United States, and their president spoke on a panel alongside a number of anti-China dissidents, like Bob Fu, who is who heads China Aid, which is funded also by the National Endowment for Democracy, and is this evangelical conservative Christian. But the Family Research Council is designated as a hate group by SPLC, the Southern Poverty Legal Center.
Law Center, yeah.
Law Center.
I mean,
And
it's a group whose president has asserted that homosexuality leads to pedophilia. I mean, that's where they're at. So,
and its current vice president is, I believe, Jeff or John Boykin, who was
General Jerry Boykin.
Jerry Boykin, who's former Undersecretary for Defense under George W. Bush. And he basically goes on about how Islam is evil and how there should be no mosques in America, and Islam shouldn't be funded by the First Amendment, shouldn't be defended by the First Amendment. So yeah, there's definitely like this common thread of like religious, ultra-conservative forces in the West that are really latching on to this sort of save the Uyghur Muslims faux concern. And yeah, it's really like diving into like the connections between different groups and their stated views on various issues is like pretty mind-boggling. It's like an endless source of bewilderment.
Yeah, it's amazing that this narrative, which has taken in large swaths of liberal America about being the new Nazi Germany, being genocidal, is largely the product of someone who is essentially a Christian fascist. I mean, who has said that for Jews Jews have to be perfected before they can be raptured by converting to Christianity, and that they will be burned in a fiery furnace by God in order to be perfected. Those who won't will be damned to an everlasting lake of fire, presumably along with Uyghur Muslims. And every single paper he writes tracks with the narrative that the US government seeks to exploit against China. So Ajit, that you wrote about his forced labor paper, which equates basically Uyghur children or Uyghur families receiving free childcare while they go to work with child separation, forced child separation, like the kind we've seen on the US-Mexican border. And he constantly in his papers conflates China's successful poverty eradication policies with genocide. In his paper on forced sterilization, which me and Gareth just ripped to shreds, which it was pretty easy to do. And I can talk about how Zentz has subsequently retracted his major findings in the paper in direct response to us. He shows like elderly Uyghur families in Xinjiang receiving checkups at an outdoor free medical clinic, the kind of which you'll never see around here in Southeast DC. And these are people who are old, like they can't have children. And he writes in the caption below, this is another example of forced sterilization and surveillance of the population. Like everyone in line is over the age of 70. I mean, there's not even like some Sarah Palin person who can have children in their mid 50s. It's like old folks. And Zentz still frames this as they're about to get like IEDs in them. So you can see, I mean, he wrote in his book, Worthy to Escape, that Satan, the Antichrist, represents the fall of capitalism. The Antichrist represents socialism. He obviously opposes birth control. And so you can see the direct connection between his religious ideology and the findings and conclusions which he comes to through statistical manipulation and sheer propaganda in his papers, which are then foisted on the liberal public through the middleman of corporate media like AP. The Intercept quotes him, the New York Times. I'm sorry, not the Intercept. Democracy Now!, as you can see, had him as a guest. So,
no, the Intercept quotes him as well.
The Intercept. Sorry, I should know the Intercept.
And they declared that there's a genocide going on in
without
Xinjiang.
any sourcing.
It's unbelievable. Have you ever seen anything like this before? Where, I mean, we saw with Darfur, there was talk about a genocide, but I've never seen such like universal acceptance of this. We're talking about, that's a serious claim, a genocide. That's mass murder. And everyone just lines up to accept it. And what I just keep thinking about reading your work, Ajit and Max, is that you couldn't get away with this if they were accusing a white country of this, a European country. This only works because Asians have been dehumanized, and because this is coming from a face of this, white Caucasian Christian, and it's palatable for a racist imperial culture. And I've never seen anything like it, where this nutcase, his inventions get an airing.
He's like an
get not just an airing, like a wide acceptance in mainstream media, but even as the picture shows, places like Democracy Now!, The Intercept, everyone just accepts it. I want to point out really quickly that when Democracy Now! Had him on, this is honestly false. They called him an independent researcher. That's not true. He works for the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Yeah. Now, if they don't want to say that, then don't have him on. But you can't lie about your guest and say that he's independent. He's not independent. And then there's one other point I want to point out here, and that's that even the State Department's lawyers, they understand, like Aaron is saying, and as Ajit said, this is a very serious charge. And when you accuse a country of genocide, that has a very specific definition in international law. Foreign policy, which has ironically been pushing this genocide narrative and nonstop Cold War propaganda in China, they published an article acknowledging that Biden's State Department lawyers concluded there's not enough evidence to prove so-called genocide in China. So while they're publicly trying to have their cake, they're also eating it too. They're claiming, for political reasons, they're claiming that China is the new Nazi Germany, is committing genocide. Well, they're actually quietly, internally acknowledging that there's not enough evidence to actually prove. And also, if you really believe that this was genocide, as so many people on Twitter and elsewhere purportedly do, wouldn't you be doing more than just
on the railways and stuff?
Go there, like put your body down, like go to the Chinese embassy, do protest. Like the thing is, no one actually believes this. It's just become a cultural thing to say China's committing genocide. It's like the cool thing to do right now. Yeah, genocide. Why not? It never goes along with it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things, really good things that have been mentioned. So like on the point of like getting away with it, not being able to get away with it, we're seeing like an example of that right now, where AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is saying it's bad faith if you criticize the migrant detention camps. Which we have footage of and we're seeing. Whereas when you see a picture of like a classroom in China, it's like a dystopian brainwashing of Uyghur children to destroy their culture. And I think it's really like disturbing the extent to which this double standard exists. And there's definitely a racist aspect to it. It didn't begin with China, and we see these sorts of double standards being accepted with so many countries across the global south. But like back on the Zen's point, like Zen's, it's pretty safe to say, is basically an ultra conservative who would espouse the same sorts of views towards women's rights to choose and abortion that we see so many discredited ultra conservatives do in the US and Canada and across the West. And he's basically the source of the sterilization campaign. So we see how these ultra conservative figures on like issues of abortion will make the most like distorted propagandistic claims. And Zenz is basically doing that about China, and all these sort of liberal progressives are accepting it as, oh my goodness, this is a atrocity and we need to talk about it. And like there's just so many examples of the issue in Xinjiang, of course, is incredibly complicated, but there's so many examples of just yellow peril racism, where it's like, oh, a picture of something Chinese or Chinese text or some like old people getting public healthcare checkup, that's IUDs. Like in the forced labor story that I wrote, in ASPI's report, the Australian Strategic Policy or Strategy and Policy Institute, they cite these Chinese language media reports which talk about young Uyghur families being able to get it. Basically, the way it sounds is basically like a jobs program where they get a position that pays them more than minimum wage, and with which they're allowed to send basically remittances back home to improve the life of their family. That's ASPI's own sources, but they're just able to link anything, and there's a huge language barrier, and there's this huge like cultural fear around China that you're basically able to say, point at them and anything's accepted.
Yeah, and what's happening now with the forced labor narrative, and then the what is it? The dirty cotton, the unclean cotton narrative. And you've got the AFL-CIA. I mean, the AFL-CIO pushing this campaign really heavily to get companies out of Xinjiang. Is that they are disemploying? I don't know if that's a word. It sounds like some academic word, but basically, they're eliminating jobs worked largely by the Uyghur population in an area that has been traditionally undeveloped, and forcing them to go longer distances to find work, or just returning to unemployment or working for much less money in like the local market. So this is sanctions by other means. This is it's a way of sanctioning China and attacking a rural population that has traditionally had nothing, and reversing a lot of the development that's been taking place. It's also giving cover to companies like Nike that have pulled out, which use sweatshops around the world so they can morally posture and say, we're no longer participating in this genocide. And I think the goal is actually to increase poverty in Xinjiang, to increase desperation, just as the US is doing in Venezuela or Syria, for example, under this false conception of how you encourage a popular rebellion, that if people are hungry and poor and starving, they'll blame the government and they'll rise up, or they'll be like they will establish fertile soil for, radicalization and recruitment from the outside. And that's the process we're seeing take place. I don't think it's clearly not going to work. It's making Chinese citizens more nationalistic. And we saw Skechers, which has a factory in Xinjiang, actually conduct its own independent review and find that the claims, apparently they reviewed Zentz's work and they found that it was rubbish. And as I mentioned before, Zentz has retracted major findings in his study that was cited by Pompeo as the basis for the genocide designation after my and Gareth's piece, and then the discovery panel I did with Canadian peace activists last week.
With Daniel Dumbrell.
Yeah, with Daniel Dumbrell and others. But yeah, I mean, and then there's the issue of genocide. I think that, we did a tribunal, a people's tribunal in Brussels called the Russell Tribunal after the Israeli assault on the Gaza Strip, which was just brutal. They were targeting entire families in their homes with targeted missiles. I was in Gaza with Dan Cohen, and we got to go in the rubble and talk to people who had lost 20 family members while they were asleep. There was just endless rubble, just absolute destruction. 551 women and children were killed. And then you have the Gaza Strip itself just under a blockade, where the Israeli military, I mean, this has been reported in Israeli media, uses mathematical calculations to determine how many calories each resident will receive each day. They said that they want to put them on a diet, but not allow them to starve. I think, we debated whether Israel was committing genocide. We had a jury of notable figures. We had an expert on genocide testify, and we couldn't come to the conclusion because we just took the designation of genocide so seriously. But I think in the current environment, we could have just flagrantly thrown that accusation around, because Israel meets the standard so much more clearly than China does. It's so obviously targeting a specific population, which it has been ethnically cleansing for 70 years in order to establish an ethno-supremacist state. And what's happening here is that the campaign about Xinjiang and Uyghurs is targeting Muslims in the West. And I believe, because I see a lot of the Uyghur groups working with pro-Israel groups, just as the Darfur campaign was exploited to give pro-Israel groups and the Israel lobby moral cover, this is also being used to weaken the Palestinian solidarity movement and to fracture Muslim American solidarity with Palestine. We saw CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, have a protest with the Uyghur American Association, this group you just wrote about. Ajit, Rushan Abbas, a former Guantanamo Bay interrogator, was helping lead this protest outside the White House last week. I haven't seen CARE do any protests against the Biden administration policies on Palestine. Maybe I'm missing it, but they're totally focused on this Uyghur issue. And obviously, there's probably, because there's more attention to it. And this is just sad to see an organization like this leave the traditional causes of its base and advance the State Department's interests.
It works beautifully from an imperial perspective, because instead of people mobilizing around issues that they can actually impact, like Gaza, like if Americans were mobilized around Gaza, can make a huge difference. It can change.
Our government doing it.
Yeah, it's our government.
The Chinese government doesn't care what we say anyway.
Yeah, and of course, and then also it displaces concern onto places that we're responsible for and to places that we're not responsible for and that are not comparable. I've never been to Xinjiang, but I have been to Gaza. And again, it's true I haven't been on the ground in Xinjiang, so I don't know. Maybe I'm missing something. But the idea that Palestinians in Gaza are treated better than Uyghurs in Xinjiang, I just think that sounds insane to me. And I say that with not having the benefit of being to Xinjiang, but it just sounds it sounds even insulting actually to fathom. So, but that's the beauty of it. It enrolls people into being concerned about places that they have no impact over and that they don't even really fully understand, into not being concerned about places that are happening right in front of our eyes with our active support. And that if we could mobilize, we could stop. And I think that's, as you indicate, that's part of the point.
Well, I also want to point out really quickly, Max alluded to this, but what's fascinating is how reporting on the Uyghurs before around 2019 has all been erased. And of course, we know that the United States, that the U.S. military was actually attacking Uyghur extremist groups in Afghanistan because there are Taliban and Al-Qaeda allied Uyghur extremists fighting in Afghanistan. And there was also a very interesting article in 2017, and here I have it up. This is in the Times of Israel, a clearly a hardcore Zionist newspaper. And the title is "Uyghur Militants in Syria Look to Zionism as Model for Their Homeland." And this is a reprint of an AP Newswire. So this is the Associated Press writing. And it talks about how since 2013, thousands of Uyghurs, etc., have traveled to Syria to train with the Uyghur militant group, the Turkestan Islamic Party, and fight alongside Al-Qaeda, playing a key role in several battles against the Syrian government of President Bashar al-Assad. But the article says, but the end of Syria's war may be the beginning of China's worst fears. And it quotes Ali, a Uyghur extremist fighter, saying, quote, "We didn't care how the fighting went or who Assad was. We just wanted to learn how to use the weapons and then go back to China." And then the Associated Press article continues, "Uyghur militants have killed hundreds, if not thousands, in attacks inside China in a decades-long insurgency that initially targeted police and other symbols of Chinese authority, but in recent years also included civilians. Extremists with knives killed 33 people, these are Chinese civilians, at a train station in 2014. They also bombed the Chinese embassy in Kyrgyzstan in September of 2016. And in 2014, they killed 25 people in an attack on a Thai shrine popular with Chinese tourists." This article also goes on and talks about how they consider Israel, the ethno-state in Israel, to be a model for the ethno-state that they want to create inside Xinjiang. So, by the way, what also happened last year? This article points out that they were fighting with the Turkestan Islamic Party. Well, what happened last year is that the Mike Pompeo State Department delisted the TIP, the Turkestan Islamic Fighting Party, the Turkestan Islamic Party, as a so-called terrorist organization. I mean, it's still recognized as a terrorist organization, by the way, by the European Union, by even U.S. allies like the United Arab Emirates, by Russia. So the
and
U.S.
the UN Security Council.
the UN Security Council, which the US also voted on because the US has veto power, the US after 9/11 voted to recognize the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, ETIM, which later is now known, it changed its name. It's now known as the TIP. The US government and its allies have recognized this group as a terrorist organization for many years. It's known that it's very closely allied with Al-Qaeda. We know that it was fighting alongside Al-Qaeda in Syria. And last year, what a coincidence. Last year, Mike Pompeo and the US State Department unlisted it as a terrorist organization, which opens the path for the US to legally support this Al-Qaeda allied terrorist group. And this leads us also to your article, Ajit, which is about, this isn't even just speculation. We know right now in the United States that the US is backing an extremist far-right Uyghur group that's armed and is trained by former US Special Operations Forces.
Yeah, there's so much that could be said about the East Turkestan Islamic movement that you brought up, but I'm hoping I'll have a piece to the Grayzone soon about that, the delisting by the Trump administration. But in a couple claims, just to briefly touch on before I move on to the gun club and the new article I just wrote, Kazat Altai, who's the president of the Uyghur American Association, invokes Israel as a sort of parallel to justify his political desire for a separate nationalist state in Xinjiang called East Turkestan. And he also regularly invokes the issue of Palestine to basically browbeat Muslim countries or Muslim majority countries for not supporting his struggle. What I wrote 2 weeks before this recent article was about the recent report that the quote-unquote independent legal report that characterized Chinese policy in Xinjiang as genocide. The co-partner with the New Lines Institute, which is one of the think tanks that authored it, is the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, which is founded by Irwin Cotler, who's basically the Canadian head of the anti-BDS movement. He's been tapped by Trudeau to help implement the political push to basically criminalize BDS and equate anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel. So it just highlights like the extreme like absurdity of people who the very forces that like are working to outlaw boycott, divest, sanctions campaign against Israel are advocating basically the exact same campaign against China. But moving on from that, on this March 21st Stop Asian Hate rally, which took place after the tragic, disgusting, murderous rampage in Atlanta, which killed 6 Asian women and 8 people in total. I believe it was a reporter with the Washington Examiner who recorded this drive-by caravan that's shouting, "Wipe out China and F China." And this got like a lot of traction on social media and a lot of condemnation, and there seemed to be like clashes where like the anti-racist demonstrators were sort of unhappy with the drive-by, and the Washington Examiner reporter claimed that they had denounced the drive-by as racist. And then the UAA, the Uyghur American Association, which is funded by the US government and has been for nearly 2 decades, came out and admitted responsibility, but said they were totally misrepresented. They condemn all forms of bigotry and stand with all forms of all victims of racism. But if you actually look into this organization, I talked about how they partnered with like right-wing organizations like the Family Research Council. They also partnered with Republican lawmaker Ted Yoho, who's like an ultra-conservative racist who voted against legislation or a resolution which would have made lynching a federal hate crime. He was one of only 4 lawmakers to do that. He was once caught on video telling a Black constituent that he's not sure if the Civil Rights Act is constitutional. He voted against a resolution condemning various forms of bigotry because it included anti-Muslim discrimination. And so you have not only these sort of very dubious links, which sort of raise questions about how anti-racist this organization that called To Wipe Out China is, they also operate this gun club and post on social media. They've now closed a number of their social media pages. But this gun club, not only does it dress in what look like either knockoffs or trying to be wannabe US military fatigues, they have US flag patches on them. And a lot of the times they're holding assault rifles and they're training with ex-special forces, individuals and institutions who say their primary sort of function is to help train US special forces and US military before they deploy. So these are the people this Uyghur American Association, peaceful, non-racist human rights group, is working with. And they're sharing like the most obscene right-wing like content on their social media.
Ben,
They're
I don't
like
know if you can show any of the social media posts.
If you scroll down, there's a screenshot of them. Like one of the more like obscene ones was they're pretty gun obsessed and seem to share the same views of a lot of like the right-wing pro-gun movement in the US. And they're comparing Central American migrants to MS-13 as like a play on like AR-15. And they're saying, oh, Democrats need to defend, I wish Democrats would defend my gun rights as much as they defend MS-13, which is like such a racist sentiment. And the founder of this organization, he features in pretty much all of these pictures. He's Farouk Altai,
right there,
who's
right
the
there.
brother. He's right there on the left, wearing the British flag in a skull format, a fitting picture. He's the brother of Kuzat Altai, who's to his right, who's the president of the Uyghur American Association. They're both the nephews of Rebia Kadir, who's basically she's in, I think, later life, and she's transitioning away from like the head of the leadership. But in the early 2000s and late 90s, she was basically the international figurehead of the Uyghur sort of international exiled community or separatist movement. She really helped mainstream the movement with the Bush administration in the early 2000s. And there's in my previous reporting for the Grayzone, I go into that. And the broader organization, which is called the World Uyghur Congress. But they are her basically nephews. And
well, sorry to cut you off really quickly, but you should also mention that until she went into exile in the United States and began working with the United States government, she was the richest woman in all of China and the 6th richest person in all of China. So, I mean, she's basically the ultra rich billionaire Uyghur oligarch, and she represents the Uyghur capitalist class that wants to break with China and have its own independent separatist region where she would be the ruler. I mean, she would be the oligarch who would dominate that independent state.
Yeah, I mean, like there's New York Times profiles on her which talk about how, literally in quotes, like I'm paraphrasing, but they're like her activism against the Chinese government forced her to give up her Audi 3 villas and far-flung business empire. That's like near exact what the US, what the New York Times describes her as. I'm not sure, I don't want to get too far afield, but this isn't like a coincidence. Like these people trace their basically political inspiration to the privileged sector of Uyghurs within Xinjiang, who during the civil war in the lead up to the Chinese Revolution had aligned with the Kuomintang, or the nationalists, which were backed by the US against the communists, and they lost. And they've never forgiven that. And they went into exile in Turkey and have been trying to basically, like the founding father, who the World Uyghur Congress, which is the parent organization of the Uyghur American Association, which features in all these gun club pictures, they call their founding father this individual, Isa Yusuf Alptekin, who spent most of his life in exile in Turkey after they lost the Civil War. He wrote letters to Nixon, praising him during the Vietnam War as standing up for all oppressed people and urging him to take on their cause. So they have deep roots to this sort of right-wing anti-communist movement or sector of people in Xinjiang who sort of see themselves as having been dispossessed by the communist revolution and are trying to get back what they think is theirs.
And so, you know, when we look at this group, it's first of all, It is a separatist organization that claims to speak on behalf of all Uyghurs, even as it is essentially calling for sanctions on the place where most Uyghurs live, and sanctions specifically targeting that place. That reminds me so much of the right-wing Venezuelan exiles based in Miami and Washington, D.C., the right-wing Cuban and Nicaraguan exiles, and in some senses, the Bandera movement, which has captured a lot of the Ukrainian exile community in the U.S. and the organizations they founded, pushing for more hostility with Russia, and before that, the Soviet Union. And the U.S. just consistently weaponizes these immigrant communities against their geopolitical targets. So there's nothing really unique here. What is notable is that, along with us, you're one of the few journalists actually writing about it and exposing it. And I think it's had an enormous impact because it shatters the narrative of just a peaceful human rights movement that's liberal. That's my view of why this is partially broken through. And at the same time, we've been labeled genocide deniers, which is a way
now
of
pro CCP.
Yeah.
Now pro CCP influencers, according to Aspie's new report.
Yeah.
Well, we should talk about that because I found that so hilarious. As just an observer of this subject, I don't go too deep in it. I don't go too deep into it, except I read you guys. And so here I see this report that is coming out against the Grayzone. So I was thinking, okay, well, maybe they're going to challenge some of what Ajit or Ben and Max have written. So, I'm looking forward to reading it. And what it is this report, which, by the way, is put out by this think tank, ASPI. It's Australian. It's funded by the Australian government, the U.S. government, the British government. It even takes money from Israel. I just learned today. It's taking some money from Israel. Yeah, that's in their thing. And also progressive champions like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. So they put out this report about the Grayzone's reporting on Xinjiang, but it's not about our reporting. It's about how many times a Chinese official has shared it on social media. That's the report. It's like multiple pages, and they go through instances, and they have screenshots, and someone's gone to the trouble of putting up a graph and like a table showing an example of a Chinese diplomat sharing a Grayzone article. Not even a Chinese diplomat, a diplomat from the World Health Organization sharing a Grayzone article. And this is all supposed to mean something. So now just the act of sharing an article, if you have a Chinese passport and you work for the Chinese government, that's a nefarious act. Not for a second, not even in a sentence, do they actually take issue with anything that the Grayzone has reported. And that is a microcosm of what we face on almost every issue, basically, where no one ever actually challenges what we say. They try to take away our right to say it and try to smear us as dupes of a foreign state.
Yep.
Yeah, Aaron, I think you put it perfectly. Take away our right to say it. The reason I think they're resorting to this absurd smear tactic is because they're trying to use the same tactics that the Alliance to for Securing Democracy also did, which is that basically if you do factual journalism, but it's shared by Russian government officials or Chinese government officials, the Alliance for Securing Democracy has smeared us and others as state-backed as part of a campaign to censor us in social media. And I think they don't care. They don't care that what we report is factual. My personal view, and I'm interested in what you all think, but I think they wrote this report because they're trying to make the case to social media corporations that they have to censor us because we are being promoted by the Chinese government, supposedly.
Yeah, they're trying to create a sense that there's coordination there when we really don't have any contact with any Chinese officials. I don't fire off articles to Chinese officials. It's just public, and then they can do what they want with it. I'm pretty sure our articles are shared much more fervently by anti-war activists in the West, but that doesn't fit the narrative. But I agree. And, you mentioned the Alliance for Securing Democracy, which actually did a preliminary study for the State Department-backed Coda story attack on us, on how many times our articles have been shared by Chinese officials. It appears that they did that study just for that article, which shows to me State Department coordination. The co-director, co-founder of the Alliance for Securing Democracy, which was itself funded by many of the same groups that fund the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, USAID, and so forth. The co-director is Laura Rosenberger, former Hillary Clinton advisor. And if you watch the footage from Anchorage of the Chinese Foreign Ministry facing off with Anthony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and their crew, you'll see a woman sitting to the left of Tony Blinken taking notes while they're getting dressed down and for being just complete hypocrites talking about human rights. And she's Laura Rosenberger. So the former head of the Alliance for Securing Democracy is now the key China advisor to Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken. And so I think it's no coincidence that we're seeing this aggressive attack revived against alternative media for puncturing their narrative with factual journalism.
And this takes us back to how we started this live stream tonight, talking about the impact and the goals of Russiagate. We were bombarded for the last 4 years with this relentless American disinformation campaign that claiming that Americans are the target of a Russian disinformation campaign. And we've been told constantly the way to protect our democracy, to defend ourselves, is to guard against so-called foreign disinformation. And so this is the playbook for that. It's to build up panic about foreign disinformation and foreign actors, supposedly who have the power to brainwash millions of Americans and sow chaos and, lead to the black, fuel the Black Lives Matter movement, as if that is even a bad thing. But so trolls, so memes and social media have been given this mythical power, which is then used to scare people into justifying censorship on anything that is deemed to be linked to foreign disinformation. And that's exactly the playbook that they're trying to do here against the Grayzone. We've seen it constantly. When I testified on the Syria issue, on the OPCW scandal before the UN Security Council, the British ambassador cited my Twitter feed as a reason why I should not be listened to. And what he was referring to is Charles Lister, this pro-war lobbyist, put out a tweet where he was citing this thing from the Senate Intelligence Committee where they claimed that, as I was talking about before, this guy Konstantin Kilimnik, who's a Paul Manafort associate, is really a Russian spy. And the Senate Intelligence Committee report claimed that Kilimnik had this secret Twitter account. And then people looked at that account and they saw that one of the people that he follows and has retweeted is me. So they were trying to draw this connection that somehow because this account retweeted me, that I'm favored by Russian spies. But I mean, one of the problems with this is that they never showed any evidence that this account actually belonged to Konstantin Kilimnik. And I have strong reason to believe that it doesn't. And regardless whether it does or not, the guy's not a Russian spy. There's no evidence that he is a Russian spy. So it's just it's a disinformation campaign.
It's the shabbiest tactic. They did it to me when my book Goliath came out, and David Duke's website wrote a semi-favorable review of it that also attacked me because the book was not anti-Semitic. And so they said, he has been endorsed by David Duke. And Eric Alterman took it to the nation. Max Blumenthal endorsed by David Duke, the Free Beacon. And David Duke, I don't think endorsed me, but he always runs around endorsing people that are a threat to the establishment. And I've just developed this conspiracy theory that David Duke's being paid just to endorse people that are a threat, which would fit with his MO because he's a complete fraudster who's been actually jailed for embezzling his own followers. But the point is, you can't control who promotes you, and you can't control who retweets you. And I think our audience is pretty diverse, but it generally situates itself within the left. But we can't control it. And, why should I be ashamed if Chinese officials are reading us? We get retweeted and tweeted by officials from around the world. Rafael Correa, who's the former president of Ecuador, tweets our stuff out. Am I supposed to be ashamed of that? I've interviewed him, but are we supposed to be ashamed that we have influence? And why are they always calling us fringe when they're pointing to how much influence we have around the world? They always say
people are so irrelevant. I'm going to spend half of this 30-page report writing about how evil they are and how much of an impact they're having.
How much department money went into calling us fringe?
It's also a white supremacist mentality, as I was talking about before, in terms of the ability to lodge these insane allegations against China. There is a presumed white supremacy here that somehow a Chinese person or diplomat retweeting us is bad, But you wouldn't say that if it was a German or
You were retweeted by a Chinaman.
yeah. I mean, it's
What it is.
and it's so normalized. And it's fascinating to look at, and it's fascinating to see how captive these people are to it. They themselves are captive to a major disinformation campaign, whether they're witting or not, or they're just useful idiots. But it's really striking, and it's to the point where now a weapons industry government funded think tank can put out a report about retweets.
Yeah.
Policing retweets and think that that's significant as if it means something.
Well, it's also about generating media coverage, because it went straight to the Wall Street Journal, who basically wrote a press release for it. And I don't think this is the end. I think there'll be more substantial attacks, potentially from a publication like the New York Times. There's going to be, I can predict like a magazine style piece on, quote unquote tankies, like the trend of tankies, just to like frighten off boomers, like in the New Yorker or the New York Times magazine. I could totally see that. But, the narrative is being broken apart. The establishment and corporate media, the foreign policy and establishment and corporate media is shaken because they have a sense of inviolability. The American empire is in a state of decline and is growing increasingly extreme. And so I just expect much more of this. And we're just going to continue to do the factual reporting we've done and be as independent as we always have been. And I don't know, I feel like we should wrap up, but if Ajit wants to.
Well, yeah, I'll pivot to Ajit. I just wanted to make a point really quickly because Aaron mentioned it. Just the racist dehumanization of China. I mean, look at how mainstream corporate media outlets are referring to China's diplomats now as wolf diplomats. They're talking about China's wolf diplomacy. Why are they saying that? Because, as Brian Becker pointed out, and we really should stress this point, this was not stressed in the media. When there was the first meeting between U.S. and Chinese diplomats under the Biden administration, it was the United States that invited China to Alaska, which is a U.S. state on U.S. territory. I mean, it was colonized, but it's U.S. territory. And they invited China. And then, as Brian Becker pointed out, immediately at the beginning of the meeting, Antony Blinken just railed against how evil China is and how it's committing all of these human rights abuses in the first ever diplomatic meeting where China was invited by the United States. I mean, that was an incredibly impolite act. You would never see
it'll be the only meeting. Sorry to interrupt it. The Chinese delegation asked for another meeting and Blinken refused. I think this will be the only meeting, and that it was designed for that.
Yeah. So the U.S. basically invited China into a trap, opened the meeting that they invited China to by attacking China. And then when China's diplomats responded, they still responded in a very diplomatic way, but a little more aggressively than normal to defend themselves. Now they're being called wolf diplomats because China or any other country is not allowed. Wolf warriors. They're not allowed to defend themselves.
No.
What they're supposed to do is just take all of the attacks, and if they ever dare to slightly slap the hand of Uncle Sam, they're called wolves.
And because they are, and because they are, that's why they're being increasingly attacked now. I don't think this is just because of China's rising economic power and how it threatens U.S. supremacy. They've also been increasingly assertive on the world stage. And I saw this firsthand at the UN when I testified about the OPCW cover-up. It was China also trying to stand up in this meeting, much to the annoyance of the Western or the North Atlantic diplomats there from the U.S., Germany, UK, France, and saying, no, we want to hear this and we want to respect the independence of the OPCW. And I could see the annoyance on the face of the North Atlantic diplomats. And I know just from my limited understanding of the UN that China has not always been historically in the last few decades this assertive and this in the face of the U.S. And so I think it's that shift and them actually trying to uphold international law and counter U.S. hegemony that we're seeing deceptions like we're seeing around Xinjiang.
Yeah, Ajit, I don't know if you want to
No, I would just echo the comments that you've all made. Like, it's definitely at the heart of it. Like, at least this sort of Twitter discourse dimension is this freak out about losing control of the narrative. Like, it's not as firm as it has been. And like this discourse about wolf warriors, if you Google it, it's been going on for like the past several years. This term's being invoked, and it's basically, how dare you speak out? Like, this is not your place. And the whole freak out about the meeting in Alaska, where it was like, oh, look at the way this Chinese diplomat's talking to us, and it's so like, there's like people so offended, and these absurd tweets going viral about, like, there's that, like, I don't know her name, but she's some American commentator going on about, oh, me and my friends are laughing about how China's behaving on the world stage. All of us are laughing about it. And I think at the heart of it is this fear of like losing control. And that's why you're already seeing it adopted, like that open letter on Syria that had the version that included the gray zone called it the mysteriously funded gray zone. So you're already seeing this sort of, it's being adopted by the narrative that, like, I think ASPI is trying to, like, it's the independent think tank that releases it, and then the New York Times writes a secondary report on it, and then it just starts getting accepted as like, oh, there's independent scholarly investigation, that there's some mystery here. And so, yeah, I think it's only going to ratchet up, but I think it's a sign that the work that's being done is effective.
Yeah. I definitely feel like sense of accomplishment here when no one disputes any facts we publish. And, you deserve a lot of credit, Ajit. And we're getting, I thought one of the funniest parts too about the ASPI report, it was like attacking us, like saying Chinese diplomats did not retweet the gray zone prior to some point in 2019. And it was like, you all didn't turn on this narrative until that point. Like no one knew who Adrian Zenz was until that point. He just came out of some like hole or some, like, he came out of like, they've just like summoned him from some evangelical seminary in the hills of Germany. And he was like, just brought down
Sound
to
of music
reap
style.
havoc. Yeah. He was just like up there yodeling and whatnot.
My question though, do they think these things through? Do they think these things through? Couldn't they have thought of a better figurehead than a far-right, anti-Semitic,
I don't think
evangelical bigot?
Couldn't they have fact-checked
on this point, though? I mean, comedy aside, I actually think it's important to keep in mind what, aside his insane evangelical extremist views, what else was he established for as supposedly an expert on? Tibet. It's not a coincidence that Adrian Zenz got his academic career started focusing on Tibet, supporting the Tibetan secessionist movement. And let's not forget, what we're living through now is very similar to this campaign that was very big in Hollywood. You know, Richard Gere and all those people were really big making propaganda for the Tibetan secessionist movement. They're all friends with the Dalai Lama. They all were like into like these weird Dalai Lama Buddhist cults. So this isn't necessarily new, but I think actually it's more effective than the Tibetan secessionist art movement was, because they were like trying to get all these crappy 90s bands to raise money for them and like student activists.
Yeah, they got
now,
the Beastie Boys. The Beastie Boys.
Max, did you go in high school to the Free Tibet concert in DC?
No, I was never. I just thought it was weird. I didn't think about it.
All my friends bussed across North America from Vancouver, BC. And I remember at the time, they're like, all right, I don't know. I didn't know. But it's so fucking funny. They find something every time. It's so funny.
I was going through this old footage of the first when Jiang Zemin came over to sign a trade deal with Bill Clinton. I think it was the most favored nation trading status. And it was still taking place in the shadow of Tiananmen Square, which is another issue we can talk about. And Tibet took center stage. But actually the day before the summit, a Uyghur exile was brought to Tom Lantos's Human Rights Commission, which was the same commission that brought Naira, the Kuwaiti ambassador's niece to lie about incubator babies being killed by Saddam Hussein's forces. And the Uyghur exile actually talked about, forced sterilization and all of these issues that are now popular today. But Tibet took center stage, and they had this concert outside the White House where Adam Yauch from the Beastie Boys was on stage with Richard Gere. Bianca Jagger was Amnesty International spokesperson there, and they were all denouncing the trade deal. And then you saw this coalition of senators that really reflects the same coalition we see today against China, which brings left and right together. Like you see the Bannonites, and then you have like the Dylan Ratiganites, the sort of all these, faux economic populists united in this new Cold War campaign. And then you had Paul Wellstone doing a press conference with Jesse Helms, the neo-Confederate racist from North Carolina. So it was the same then as it was now, but Tibet was the human rights cause, and they hadn't really worked up this situation with Xinjiang. And that was because, at that point, the separatist movement hadn't fully developed. You had a lot of foreign fighters coming back from Afghanistan to Xinjiang, and they were bringing their tactics and Wahhabi ideology with them, which led to the rise of ETIM, the East Turkestan Islamic movement, that carried out these violent attacks and then brought a kind of surveillance regime and a crackdown between 2014 and 2017. So that's kind of why I think we're seeing Tibet replaced with this issue.
And Max, just to situate this, so we're talking about the late 90s, early 2000s when it comes to Tibet, right?
Yeah.
And so what is happening in reality then? The U.S. is sanctioning Iraq, killing, untold numbers of people. Madeleine Albright saying the price is worth it. Clinton is bombing Iraq, setting the stage for the invasion.
Bombing Yugoslavia.
So those are, and of course, the occupation of Palestine is continuing. Israel is expanding its settlements in the West Bank with full U.S. support. So those are the real crimes that are going on throughout this period. And then what are impressionable young Westerners motivated to do is mobilize for free Tibet.
And Darfur. I remember neighbors of mine growing up in DC would come up to me and be like, "What are we going to do about Darfur?" Yeah. I said, "What the hell is Darfur? Where's Dar 5 and Dar 6? What are you talking about? Like, where is this coming from?" And they're like, "We have to do something now," because they were like Washington Post subscribers and listened to NPR. And
Darfur got really big after Iraq, and also really big after Israel invaded Lebanon in the summer of 2006. All of a sudden, we're supposed to care about Darfur all of a sudden. And when in reality, and no one even talks about it anymore because it's served its purpose. It's lived out its use. And same thing with today. Now we're talking about Xinjiang while we're pick any place in the world, Syria.
The U.S. extorted $300 million out of Sudan, and they got taken off the terror list, which was just an obvious tool of extortion.
And now Sudan is normalizing with Israel.
So that's over. It's like, the wolf warriors, like if China could find some Boris Yeltsin to like drink his face off and sell off the country to U.S. corporations, then you wouldn't hear a word about genocide again. It would just be over.
Yeah.
It would be like, he'd get the Nobel Prize nomination with like whatever the next white helmets are, wherever they turn up.
They tried that with Liu Xiaobo, but he died.
Yeah. Liu Xiaobo, he was a great progressive, right?
Yeah.
Who supported the Vietnam War and Western colonialism.
And I just want to say about Syria quickly. We talked about it before, but the sanctions, the lack of attention to it, this way to immiserate a country even further, destroy a country without dropping a bomb or sending in weapons or sending in soldiers, just by crippling the country, by blocking it from the financial system, by keeping it away from its own resources, its own oil and wheat. And we don't talk about it. Try to get a mention of it in the U.S. media. There's never an article specifically about the U.S. sanctions in a U.S. mainstream paper like the New York Times or the Washington Post. It's always like Syria is going through some problems, and the sanctions get like a passing mention buried at the bottom. And
it drives me insane. I mean, because we were talking actually about like the allegations of forced sterilization because the birth rate has gone down in Xinjiang, like it's gone down across China because China is developing and they give away 1 billion free condoms a year, for example. They emphasize family planning across the board. That's what like liberals in the US, I think, support. But then there was this article in the New York Times on Venezuela and women not being able to access birth control. And it mentioned American sanctions in 2 words. The rest of the article just gave you this sense that Maduro is taking it away from them because he's this patriarchal, masculinist scumbag who's incompetent and he just wants people to be mired in poverty and having too many kids, as though, and of course the real reason is US sanctions tank the economy, destroy the economy, deprive the government of assets to give out free birth control, and no one can afford the birth control that is for sale in the stores. That's the story. And why can't they tell that? Because it's just not allowed in US corporate media. You're not allowed. This Time reporter, Carl Vick, who I actually knew in Palestine, he was one of the better ones. His wife used to work for Human Rights Watch, I think, and he had some sympathy for the Palestinians. I like showed him around a West Bank village once. He just went on this propaganda tour of Colombia and did this absurd press release in time for Ivan Duque and his little narco mafia that's overseeing hundreds of killings of social leaders just this year alone. And then he said that, you know, they're heroes because they're taking in these Venezuelan migrants and they're treating them so well when actually they're living in hell in Colombia. And the Venezuelan migrants are fleeing an incompetent authoritarian. There was no mention of US sanctions anywhere in that article. And it's just like, Maduro's just like this dumb guy. That's the way they make it out. Like, oh, I don't know what to do with, like he's Idi Amin.
Let's manage my own economy. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's totally not the case when you can watch my interview with Delcy Rodriguez, the Venezuelan vice president, who's overseeing their economic reforms and attempts at managing the economy under sanctions. These are not stupid people. I mean, this is someone who is actually herself a really well-established scholar who comes from a revolutionary background. But that's the portrayal in the US press. It's completely racist in that it just falls back on the accepted racist chauvinism of the way that Americans are supposed to perceive third world leaders without actually explaining the context that they find themselves in, which has been imposed on them by us. That's one of the most frustrating things. I think I talked about it before on one of our live streams about how I actually, at a Maduro press conference, I got to meet the Hack Pack that was down in Caracas, that's like based there. And they're just not journalists. They're like stenographers for the State Department posing as journalists. And one of them approached us, me and Anya and a friend, Zoe Pepper, who does really good work of her own. We're just standing around at People's Dispatch. It's a very worthwhile site. We were just standing around waiting for this press conference to begin. It was like taking forever to begin because everyone had to get COVID tested. Like the only times that I've ever had like COVID tests forced on me, by the way, were in Venezuela. Anyway, so we're standing around and they put out like a table of snacks for all these people who want the government to be like Maduro to be dragged through the streets by the back of Guaido's motorcycle. And they're all like feasting off the snacks and standing around. And then one of them comes over to us and is like, new in town? Like, what are we at, like happy hour at Studebaker's or something? Like, what the hell is new in town? Like a pickup line. And then he starts like grilling us, like, how did you get here? He's basically like trying to say, like, did the government send you here? And like, I was like, no, we flew on our own on like this Avior airline and got stuck in Dominican Republic for a night. And then I'm like, you know what? Fuck this guy. Why do you never, why am I even trying to be nice to you? Like, why? And I was just like, why do you never, ever write about sanctions? Like, why do you never talk about, if you wanted to run a whole campaign about how sanctions is destroying the civilian population in this country, you could actually help change US policy. Yeah. I mean, you write for a major publication. I'm not going to name him, but he writes for a publication that's just like one of the worst. And he was like, it's just so hard to tell where sanctions affect people. And it's impossible to know. And, what it's really about is corruption. I mean, you got this, the government's just giving away cash to its cronies. And like, he just gave me some story that I'd never heard of about like Maduro giving like bags of cash to people. I've heard that story from other journalists about Aristide, by the way.
Of course. Yeah, of
And
course.
like he had rotten cash in his safe when they
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
and I was just like, you motherfucker, like this is what you actually believe. And he comes from Washington, DC, and he's like, yeah, I was raised there. And like he comes from pure privilege. I don't know, for all I know, his family's from the State Department. But this is the mentality of the press corps, the international correspondents. And they just, so that omission of sanctions, which is the worst human rights crime in the world right now, is it underlines all their coverage and allows them to blame the victims.
And it's everywhere. So in the 1990s, Democracy Now! Did amazing coverage on the impact of the sanctions on Iraq. It stood apart. Now we try to find a DN segment on the sanctions in Syria. Zilch, nothing.
Yeah, the only mention in The Intercept of the Caesar sanctions on Syria was an article by the star reporter Ida Chavez, who's just been brought on at The Nation, which attacks Code Pink for opposing the Caesar sanctions. And it was like a press release for the Syria regime change groups.
And that was in 2000. I just checked. It was in 2019. That's the last time The Intercept has covered the sanctions on Syria, 2 years ago, before they were even passed. And now the country is approaching famine, facing the harshest sanctions in the world. And our supposed leading adversarial sites can't even manage an article or a segment about it.
Yeah, I mean, how do people think that Madeleine Albright was pressed to make those repulsive comments that it was worth it to kill
journalism?
It was Leslie Stahl at 60 Minutes, who's a complete tool, but it was because there was this ongoing massive campaign that was putting so much pressure on the Clinton administration that the corporate media felt compelled to ask about it. There is no campaign now. I mean, the peace groups are like starting to do something, but they've never been weaker. And of course, they won't mention us.
Yeah, on this note of, I just wanted to bring this up. I had this. This is an incredible graph made by a friend of ours, Alan McLeod, a great journalist, and it just shows this. I mean, you were talking about these stories that are ignored by corporate media, and then they suddenly appear, like Tibet or Darfur or Syria or Libya, and then they just disappear, never to be heard from again. This graph to me says everything. I mean, this March was the 10th anniversary of the NATO war in Libya, which destroyed the state of Libya. And 10 years later, there's still no central government. And this graph from Alan McLeod shows that every once in a while there's a spike, depending on whatever policy is. But in 2011, there was this massive spike of interest in Libya and human rights. And then it just died. As soon as NATO intervened and destroyed the government, it was just basically just never mentioned again.
Yeah, mission accomplished.
And that's the role of the media. I mean, that's exactly what it does. And that's why there's no discussion of the sanctions in Syria. You know, I was thinking of what context would be for the sanctions in Syria to ever be mentioned in mainstream corporate media. And it would probably be that there's, like, let's say Russia or China wanted to militarily intervene or something. I mean, that would be the only context. I mean, it's absolutely preposterous. But even then, like, I mean, they're not going to, it's just like, they're never going to mention the effects of U.S. sanctions.
It kind of reminds me of the AIDS crisis in the 80s when it was just allowed to fester because who is it killing? Gay people, people of color who are being mass incarcerated. And when the corporate media and the establishment, the political establishment, decided to finally make a big deal about AIDS, who was the poster boy? It was Ryan White. They finally found a white boy, a white kid from the suburbs whose
last name was White.
Literally his last name was White. And he got a blood transfusion and got AIDS and died. And so they were like, I remember the Ryan White story there were all these TV movies about him. And I was supposed to like freak out for Ryan White. Like I was supposed to fear now that I could get AIDS, but gay people were just being rendered completely invisible when they were just, it was thanks to the work of ACT UP. I mean, anyone who's watching this now, I always recommend this documentary made by Sarah Schulman on ACT UP, which was the radical, LGBTQ group, mostly of LGBTQ activists, of people who had AIDS or whose family members had AIDS, and they basically they besieged the Reagan White House and local lawmakers and did radical direct action to force the government and the NIH to invest in studies. I mean, they forced like Fauci to turn around. He was like initially their enemy.
Yeah.
And they put this campaign and their community on the map. And, you know, their slogan, which I saw everywhere around DC when I was young, was silence equals death. It was such an effective slogan. And it's the same kind of slogan we could apply to sanctions. Sanctions equal death. They don't equal death for, for our neighbors in the US, maybe, although many people in the US are kind of sanctioned in a way. The people been lining up for food during the pandemic, but sanctions equal death for millions and millions of people around the world who have been rendered invisible by our media, who are just besieged. They have no way of accessing the world financial system or food or water or medical supplies. It's because of the deliberate decisions made by the Biden administration, the Trump administration, whatever the next administration will be. I would like to plaster DC with signs that say sanctions equal death. And you know, this should be the human rights cause of our time.
1/4 of the global population is living in a country under U.S. sanctions.
That's
One
one
third,
quarter.
according to a Venezuelan analysis.
1/3.
You know, on this front, I want to recommend to anyone who hasn't read it, Max wrote a piece about Richard Nephew, who has recently been appointed to be an official in the Biden administration as the deputy envoy to Iran, so working under Rob Malley. And Max wrote this piece about Nephew's book called The Art of Sanctions, which Ben turned into a graphic called The Art of Sadism, where Nephew brags about his role in crafting the U.S. sanctions, especially on countries like Iran. And he boasts that he ended up hurting civilians, raising chicken prices, depriving people of meals around the holidays, depriving people of the ability to fix their cars because they couldn't import the right parts.
He bragged on a panel at Columbia that he increased unemployment rates to make things sticky.
And so this is the sadist. This is the sadist who's now working in the State Department. It's why I don't call it the State Department anymore. I call it the sadist department, because that's what they do. They inflict misery on foreign populations who live under governments who don't submit to U.S. dictates.
Yeah, I mean, they're the hate department, and you could call the U.S. ship of state the pirate ship of state, because it's literally carting out Syrian oil from the oil fields it occupies and selling it off possibly to Israel through Turkey. I mean, that's pretty well established. Yeah. Looting Venezuela's foreign assets. I mean, it's just like the ultimate world looter. But Nephew, you know, this guy, you look at his Twitter account and it's pictures of him with his family and his children, and they're, you know, on their porch with Biden signs, and they're just like living in this liberal neighborhood. I mean, I think I know the neighborhood they live in, and it's like, you walk through that neighborhood, everyone has Black Lives Matter signs and signs that say like, we believe in science and we know hate has no home here. And that stuff, they're so nice. He loves his children. Tony Blinken, he said the other day, that when he thinks of Syria, he thinks of his 2 children. And I said, and in Samantha Power, when she testified for her confirmation for USAID chief, which is, you know, basically, you know, global destabilization arm of the State Department, she tweeted a picture of her children at her hearing. So they're all invoking their children. They love their children. They love their children just as much as the Nazi doctors that Robert J. Lifton, the famous psychologist, who he interviewed for his book by that title, The Nazi Doctors. These are people who compartmentalize, or they embody the psychological tendency that Lifton called doubling, where they're very good family people. At night when they come home, they genuinely love their children, and by day they go to work and they're absolute monsters, and they slaughter people. They kill people with the stroke of a pen. They are, as I think Anya called Nephew, little Eichmanns.
Yeah, she did.
They are the worst.
And then he blocked all of us.
Yeah, then he blocked all of us. But I mean, that term is, you know, a very apt term for these figures. And I said to Tony Blinken, you know, if you treated your children like you treat Syrians, then you would rob them at gunpoint, deprive them of food and water and medicine, and you would be jailed for child abuse.
Child murder.
Child murder. Yeah, he's a child killer. That's why I call him Tony Blinkskrieg. I don't know. I mean, we're going to up to 3 hours. I don't know if Ajit is got anything else to say, but I gotta get off here. And like as George W. Bush said, I gotta put food on my family.
Yeah, just like the sort of like contradiction between like the hip dad in the like neighborhood with the lawn signs, while implementing and helping design this brutal, murderous sanctions regime is like, it's at like the heart of a lot of like what we've been talking about is like this blindness, which is like, I would say like directly rooted in like it's directly connected with like the legacy of like colonial minded paternalism, where it's like, it's related to what Aaron and Max mentioned about corruption and like how everything can just be passed off on corruption. It's like the notion of they don't know how to conduct their own affairs. They're like the colonial sort of ideology towards like indigenous peoples is like they're inept. They don't know how to tend to the land. They're not cultivating the land. We need to come in and save them. And so they're able to completely erase their own murderous actions and their own responsibility and just put it on, oh, you know, domestically, there's like this guy is giving away money to this person, or this person is giving bribes to this person, and they completely write themselves out of the story.
Yeah, completely. And I think you pointed out there's like an interparliamentary committee on China.
Oh my goodness. Okay. I'm looking forward to writing. This is going to be maybe one of the more fun articles to write about. I'm sure you've all seen on Twitter, they seem to do a lot of their activity, the Interparliamentary Commission or Interparliamentary Alliance on China, like this very clear Cold Warrior alliance being set up of basically lawmakers across, they say they're international, but I went through their listed membership of lawmakers, and aside from some lawmakers from US like staunch military ally Japan, 92% of the members were white. And it was just like, it's just so obvious, like the racial, like yellow peril, Cold Warrior ideology that's like at the heart of this.
Yeah, and like you look at the countries, like they always are like 52 countries recognized Juan Guaido. Like they all got together independently and decided, like, we like this Guaido guy. We like the cut of his jib. Kind of reminds us of Obama. It's like, no, they're just like the white countries that have like feasted on the carcass of the global South traditionally, and the US tells them what to do. Like that's, you just look at the map and you're like, those are the white countries, and like a few of their like Trump's apprentices in Latin America who are like represent the white elites of their country.
And Haiti, which got bullied into selling out the country that was giving it subsidized oil and loans.
Yeah. I mean, and look at what Moise, how many people voted for him? He's like, in a lot of ways, he's like Guaido. He like maybe 16,000 people in total voted for him. He's like the most hated man in Haiti. He couldn't get elected dog catcher. And that's who recognized Guaido. Who's this other guy in Uganda that the NED tried to like, because they got sick of Museveni, and so they came up with this guy Bobi Wine, and he did a seminar recently with Guaido. It's like, it's just so pathetic. Like they just, anyway.
Well, we're 3 hours.
We're at 3 hours, so I'm gonna peace out. If anyone else has anything to say, you got to do so without me.
I think we can end it here. A lot more we didn't even get to, but we'll get to it in another one. Thanks everyone for tuning in. We didn't get to all the super chats, but we really appreciate them. We appreciate your support. Let's everyone just say some final words of goodbye and get out of here.
Go, Ajit. You want to conclude with what you're working on and where people can find your work?
Yeah, you can find my work at the Grayzone predominantly, and you can follow me on Twitter at Ajit Singh. I'm currently working on looking into the source of a lot of the increasingly cited testimonial evidence about the alleged concentration camps in Xinjiang and the Xinjiang victims database that's operated out of Kazakhstan. And hopefully we'll have something on that soon.
Yeah, great. And I'm really looking forward to it. And again, Ajit, I mean, your contributions have been absolutely enormous and made a major impact. And I think, you know, the most important thing to me about it and about doing this work is just correcting the record, correcting the historical record, and just putting it out there for people who are skeptical and who refuse to be intellectually captured by this massive state disinformation campaign run through US regime media. So yeah, find out more at thegrayzone.com. We've got some incredible investigations coming this week that I've been working on. I mean, like really hard hitting stuff. And I don't want to telegraph our punches, but I'm really excited about what's to come this week. And you'll see, because you'll see various freakouts from different like sectors that all connect around the support, their mutual supportive empire.
Yeah, and I'll add that, you know, we talked for 3 hours now and we hit a lot of different topics, but I think it went well. It was very organic. There were a few topics we didn't get to, and hopefully we're going to have another stream sometime soon, including the Matt Getz scandal, which is crazy. It also involves Iran and the CIA agent who was allegedly caught in Iran, Robert Levinson, and the Israeli government is allegedly involved. So, I mean, we'll unpack some of that because a lot of that's not being discussed in major corporate media outlets. And then another issue that we didn't get to talk about is the latest developments with the OPCW Syria scandal. Aaron has been really covering that extremely well. I mean, he's the only journalist, well, not the only, but really one of the only journalists covering this beat. And that's also related to his reporting on Bellingcat. And Bellingcat was caught. I mean, so we'll have another stream soon looking at Bellingcat's extremely shady behavior. And then there's another.
I'll have more reporting on that soon, where we not only caught them publishing fraudulent material, but we also caught them having someone outside of Bellingcat author their material and write their questions for them, which shows that they're even more of a fraud than we thought they were. So there'll be more on that soon.
Yeah, and then there's another scandal that so we are going to have a live stream again soon, and in that we're also going to talk about how a Western government contractor ran a sting operation to entrap a British anti-war academic to try to discredit his work, exposing the massive corruption of the Syria regime change organization funded by Western governments with tens of millions of dollars. So, I mean, just more, not only exposing just the hypocrisy and the immorality of a lot of these Western regime change organizations, but also how they have been profiting on the destruction of an entire nation. While they're accusing us of insanely, without any evidence, they're falsely claiming that we are the ones backed by boogeymen governments. They're the ones who have been raking in millions of dollars, profiting on the destruction of Syria. It is so cynical and so disgusting. So we're going to have another stream soon to talk about all of that.
All right. Thanks a lot, everybody. Thanks, Ajit, for joining
everybody.
us.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Talk to everyone soon. Thanks so much for watching us at YouTube. And for people watching, you can also follow us over at Twitch. Go to twitch.tv/thegrayzonenews. And as always, thanks for watching and listening. This will be a podcast version as well. And this is Ben, and we're out. See you next time.